Chapter 9. Descent into darkness. The air in the chamber was heavy, thick with the hum of magical energy radiating from the runes etched into the walls. A faint metallic tang hung in the air, sharp and acrid, mingling with the smell of stone warmed by ancient power. The oppressive weight seemed to press on their chests, and the occasional flicker in the runes cast long, eerie shadows that danced unsettlingly across the walls. Jax stood with the shard cradled in his palm, its soft glow casting eerie shadows across his face. He tightened his grip, feeling the power pulsing faintly beneath his fingers, as though alive. The weight of Celine's words sat heavily in the room, unspoken but understood by all of them. "There's someone helping them," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her violet eyes flickered, unfocused, as though she were seeing something far away. "Here. Inside these walls." Jax's stomach churned, and his eyes darted toward Thorne.
The old mage leaned heavily on his staff, his face impassive but his knuckles white around the worn wood. "A traitor." Thorne's words weren't a question. Celine nodded faintly, her expression tight. Her hands twitched at her sides, and her eyes darted briefly to the flickering runes before returning to the others. "Someone who knows this place. Someone who knows us." Her voice carried a sharp edge, as though each word cost her a measure of composure. Elyra, perched on the edge of the table with her bow across her knees, let out a sharp breath. "Oh, that's just perfect," she muttered, her voice light but carrying a faint edge of tension. Her fingers tightened slightly on the bow, betraying the unease she worked so hard to mask. "Not only do we have Malika's pets clawing at the door, but now we've got a snake in the nest." "Lovely. Focus," Thorne snapped, his voice like steel cutting through her sarcasm. "We'll root out the traitor, but first we need to ensure this fortress doesn't collapse around our ears. The wards are failing. We're running out of time." Before Jax could speak, the distant sound of clashing steel and shouted commands echoed down the corridor. The glow of the runes dimmed, and for a brief moment, the chamber plunged into near darkness. Elyra's wolf, Shadow, growled low in its throat, its silver fur bristling. "They're through the outer defenses," Thorne said grimly, his face tight with urgency as he strode toward the door. His staff clutched tightly in his hand glowed faintly, the lines of his jaw set like stone. Each step was brisk, purposeful, as though he carried the weight of the crumbling fortress on his shoulders. "If they take the inner wards, we're finished." Jax didn't hesitate. He shoved the shard into its holster on his belt and followed Thorne, Elyra, and Celine out of the chamber, the tension in his chest tightening with every step. The corridor opened into a wide hall where defenders were already locked in battle with the invaders. The clang of steel on steel reverberated through the space, accompanied by the cries of wounded soldiers and the snarls of shadowy beasts. Embermidges stood their ground, their hands glowing with spells that burst like fireworks against the darkness. The defenders' faces were etched with exhaustion, their movements driven more by sheer will than strength, as waves of Malika's forces pressed relentlessly forward. The air itself seemed to pulse with the oppressive magic, thick and suffocating, adding to the chaos of the scene. Shadowy figures melted in and out of the flickering torchlight, their faces obscured but their weapons gleaming with a sickly black sheen. The magic in the air was oppressive, thick with the taint of Malika's dark influence. Jax drew the shard, its light cutting through the shadows, and charged into the fray. Thorne's voice rang out above the chaos. "Keep them away from the runes. If they break the wards completely," a shadowed blade flashed toward Thorne's head, but Jax was already moving. He raised the shard, and a blast of radiant energy erupted from it, striking the attacker in the chest and scattering the shadowy form into nothingness. The shard vibrated in his hand, its power thrumming with a kind of feral satisfaction. "Nicely done," Elyra called out as she loosed an arrow into the throat of another shadow creature. "Maybe you're not completely useless after all." Jax ignored her and pushed forward, his focus narrowing to the next attacker. The fight blurred into a chaotic mix of light and shadow, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he parried and struck with the shard's energy. Elyra's wolf darted in and out of the melee, its teeth flashing as it tore through their enemies with savage efficiency. "Hold the line," Thorne shouted, his staff blazing as he unleashed a wall of fire that forced the remaining attackers back. The flames roared, licking at the edges of the stone walls, but the figures in the shadows only regrouped, their movements eerily synchronized. Jax fell back toward Thorne, his chest heaving. "They just keep coming," he said through gritted teeth. "We can't hold them all off." Celine's voice, soft but firm, cut through the noise. "We won't have to." The others turned to her, but before she could explain, the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. A man stepped through, his footsteps echoing loudly in the sudden stillness. He was tall, his black cloak pristine despite the battle raging around him. His face was calm, but his eyes glowed faintly green, the unmistakable mark of Malika's influence. Jax's blood ran cold. He knew that face. "You've done well to hold out this long," the man said, his voice smooth and mocking. "But I'm afraid this is where your little rebellion ends." The man's words hung in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. Jax's fingers tightened on the shard, its glow intensifying as if responding to his rising anger. Thorne's staff flared to life beside him, the flame at its tip casting long, flickering shadows across the hall. Elyra was the first to break the silence. "Oh, fantastic," she muttered. "Another smug lackey with delusions of grandeur." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his glowing eyes. "Ah, the archer with the clever tongue. I'll be sure to silence it soon enough." Elyra's wolf growled low in its throat, its hackles rising as it took a step forward, baring its teeth. Elyra's hand tightened on her bow, her body tensed like a coiled spring. Jax stepped forward, his voice steady despite the roiling anger in his chest. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as though surprised by the question. "You mean to tell me that Malika's finest doesn't warrant an introduction?" He chuckled softly. "No matter. You won't need to remember my name where you're going." Without another word, the man raised a hand, and the glow of the runes on the walls intensified, their light shifting from soft gold to an ominous, sickly green. The air grew heavier, the oppressive magic pressing down on Jax like a physical weight. Thorne's voice was sharp and urgent. "He's channeling the wards. Stop him." Jax didn't need to be told twice. He surged forward, the shard blazing in his grip, and swung it in a wide arc. A beam of radiant energy shot toward the man, but he deflected it with a flick of his wrist. The force of the impact sent a shockwave rippling through the hall, the walls groaning under the strain. "You're predictable," the man said with a sneer, his lips curling into a contemptuous smile that barely concealed his amusement. His eyes glowed faintly, the green light flickering like embers as he folded his hands behind his back, exuding a confidence that bordered on disdain. "And hopelessly out of your depth." "We'll see about that," Jax snapped, gritting his teeth as he channeled more power into the shard. The glow of the artifact grew blinding, and for a moment, it seemed as though the oppressive magic in the room faltered. Elyra took the opportunity to loose an arrow, the glowing projectile streaking toward the man with unerring precision. But he moved with inhuman speed, dodging the arrow and retaliating with a wave of dark energy that slammed into the wall behind them, leaving a smoking crater in its wake. Shadow lunged, teeth flashing, his movements quick and precise as he aimed for the man's exposed side. The wolf's growl deepened, a fierce sound that echoed his unrelenting determination. But the man conjured a barrier of green energy at the last moment, sending Shadow skidding back with a yelp. Elyra's breath caught, her expression shifting from fury to concern as she rushed to Shadow's side, her hands trembling slightly as she steadied her bow. Elyra rushed to her companion's side, her expression dark with fury. "Thorne!" Jax shouted. "We need to cut him off." The mage didn't reply immediately, his focus entirely on the wards. Thorne could feel the ancient spell work unraveling under Malika's influence, each thread of magic strained to its breaking point. His mind raced through the incantations, searching for a way to stabilize the defenses, but the complexity of the wards, woven over centuries by countless embermages, made his task feel like trying to mend a spider's web in a storm. Every second counted, and the weight of their survival bore down on him like a leaden cloak. His staff pulsed with fiery light as he muttered an incantation under his breath, the ancient words laced with power. The sickly green glow of the runes began to flicker, destabilizing as Thorne's magic clashed with the traitors. "I can disrupt him," Thorne said finally, his voice strained, "but it won't hold for long. Be ready." Celine stepped forward then, her usually serene face set in grim determination. Her hands glowed faintly, a warm silver radiance spilling from her fingers as though the very air around her pulsed in response. Her voice, soft and lilting, seemed to cut through the heavy magic in the room, each word resonating with a subtle power that made even the flickering runes pause for a heartbeat. "I see you," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "And I see the darkness that binds you. It will not prevail." The man's smile faltered, just for a moment, and Jax seized the opportunity. With a roar, he charged forward, the shard blazing like a star in his hand. The man raised his hands to defend himself, but the combined force of Jax's strike and Thorne's incantation shattered his barrier, sending him sprawling backward. But before Jax could press the advantage, the ground beneath them shook violently. The walls groaned as cracks spread through the stone, and chunks of debris began to rain down from above. The glow of the runes flickered one last time before snuffing out entirely, plunging the hall into near darkness. "The wards are gone," Thorne shouted. "This place won't hold much longer." "We're not leaving him," Jax growled, his eyes fixed on the man struggling to rise from the rubble. "We don't have a choice," Elyra snapped, grabbing his arm. "Unless you want to be buried here." The hall shuddered again, and Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. "Jax, now." Reluctantly, Jax turned and followed the others, the sound of the collapsing fortress echoing in his ears. His heart wrenched at the decision, each step away from the confrontation filling him with a gnawing sense of failure. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to turn back as doubts clawed at his resolve. The shard at his side pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power he held but hadn't fully mastered. "This isn't over," he thought, the promise echoing in his mind as loudly as the crumbling stone around him. As they fled down the corridor, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. The man's glowing eyes met his, burning with malevolent certainty. Jax felt a chill crawl up his spine, the promise in those eyes searing itself into his thoughts. It wasn't just a threat, it was a vow, and Jax knew that this battle was only the beginning of something far darker. He clenched his fists, determination hardening in the pit of his stomach, even as the walls groaned and dust filled the air. The air grew colder the deeper they fled into the heart of the fortress. Each breath carried a damp, earthy chill, as if the stone itself exhaled despair. The faint echoes of their footsteps were swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence, broken only by the distant groans of the fortress's failing structure. The sharp tang of magic lingered in the air, tinged with something acrid and metallic, a reminder of the corruption spreading through the ancient wards. The once familiar corridors now felt like a labyrinth, twisting and turning with each step. Jax led the way, the shard in his hand casting a pale, flickering glow that barely held the encroaching shadows at bay. Behind him, Thorne's staff glimmered faintly, the ember at its tip a reminder of the power the mage still wielded despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "Where are we going?" Elyra asked, her voice sharp with frustration. Shadow padded beside her, his ears pinned back as he sniffed the air. "This is a fortress, not a tunnel network. We can't just wander aimlessly while it collapses around us," she said, her voice rising with frustration. Beneath her sharp tone, there was a flicker of unease, a tension in her words that hinted at the fear she tried to hide. "We're not wandering," Thorne replied, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. He glanced at the glowing runes on the walls, their light flickering and dimming with each passing moment. "We're heading for the lower sanctum. If there's any chance of stabilizing the wards, it's there." Celine, walking slightly behind the group, paused for a moment and placed her hand on the wall. A faint vibration ran through her fingers, a pulse of corrupted energy that felt cold and invasive. The stone seemed to hum with a chaotic rhythm, as if it carried the traitor's intent within its very core. Celine's eyes narrowed as she concentrated, her breath hitching at the sheer malevolence she could sense. Her violet eyes narrowed as she concentrated. The traitor's magic, it's lingering here. Stronger than before. Jax turned to face her, his grip tightening on the shard. "Can you tell where it's coming from?" "It's everywhere," she murmured, her voice tinged with unease. "The wards are tangled with it, corrupted. If we don't act soon." She didn't finish, but the grim expression on her face spoke volumes. The group pressed on, the sound of distant collapses and the occasional groan of the fortress's failing structure punctuating the silence. Each step felt heavier, as though the very air were conspiring against them. "What happens if the sanctum's compromised?" Elyra asked, her tone more subdued now, the edge of her usual confidence replaced by a quiet unease. Her voice wavered slightly, as though the weight of the question was one she wasn't sure she wanted answered, but she held herself steady, refusing to let her fear show completely. "Then the fortress falls," Thorne said bluntly. "And us with it." They rounded a corner and came upon a vast chamber, its ceiling supported by massive stone columns carved with intricate runes. At the far end of the room, a swirling vortex of green energy pulsed violently, its deep, resonant hum filling the chamber like the growl of a slumbering beast. Tendrils of dark magic snaked out, lashing against the walls with a crackling hiss that sent shards of stone tumbling to the floor. The vortex twisted and writhed, its surface flickering with chaotic flashes of light, as if it were alive and straining to break free of some unseen tether. The sight made Jax's stomach drop. "That's not supposed to be there," Thorne muttered, his voice laced with equal parts awe and dread. Elyra let out a low whistle. "I'm guessing that's the source of our problems." Selene stepped forward, her gaze locked on the vortex. "It's feeding on the wards," she said, "draining their power and twisting it. If we can't sever the connection, then we're done for," Jax finished, gripping the shard tightly. The artifact pulsed in response, its light brightening as though sensing the danger. Thorne moved toward the vortex cautiously, his staff raised. "This magic, it's more than Malika's influence. Someone, or something, has amplified it. We'll have to be careful." "Careful won't cut it," Elyra said, narking an arrow and drawing her bow. Her jaw tightened, and a flicker of resolve lit her eyes, the kind that came from knowing there was no room for hesitation. She adjusted her stance slightly, a practiced movement that spoke of discipline honed under pressure. "Whatever's causing this, we need to stop it now." Jax stepped up beside her, the shard glowing steadily in his hand. "We'll deal with it together. Thorne, can you figure out how to disrupt the vortex?" The mage nodded, his focus already shifting to the swirling mass of energy. "I'll need time. Keep anything, or anyone, off me while I work." "You heard him," Jax said, turning to the others. "Let's move." As Thorne began his incantations, the air around the vortex grew even more volatile. Shadows coalesced into shapes, forming humanoid figures with glowing green eyes. They moved with unnatural grace, their movements fluid and predatory. "Here they come," Elyra muttered, releasing her first arrow. The glowing projectile struck one of the figures square in the chest, and it dissolved into wisps of shadow. "Shadow, take the left." The wolf snarled and leapt into action, his claws raking through another figure as it lunged toward Thorne. Jax followed close behind, the shard in his hand releasing bursts of light that cut through the shadows like a blade. Selene stood near the center of the room, her hands glowing as she chanted softly. The silver light radiating from her fingers ebbed and flowed in rhythmic pulses, as though in harmony with her words. The air around her seemed to shimmer, charged with a tangible energy that made the hair on the back of Jax's neck stand on end. Her voice, low and melodic, wove through the chaos like a thread of clarity, each word resonating with an almost otherworldly power. Tendrils of silver light extended from her fingers, weaving a protective barrier around Thorne as he worked. Sweat beaded on her brow, but her expression remained calm and focused. The battle raged on, each shadowy figure vanishing only to be replaced by another. Jax's arm ached from wielding the shard, but he refused to falter. He could see the strain on Elyra's face, the way her movements were becoming slower, more deliberate. Even Shadow's growls were tinged with fatigue. "Thorne, how much longer?" Jax shouted, deflecting a shadowy blade with a burst of light. The weight of the shard grew heavier in his hand, and his breaths came fast and shallow, tinged with the bitter taste of desperation. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the mounting pressure of holding the line while chaos threatened to consume them. "Almost there," the mage replied, his voice tight with concentration. The runes on his staff glowed brighter, their light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, the vortex let out a deafening roar, and the entire chamber shook violently. A massive tendril of dark energy lashed out, striking the protective barrier Selene had created. The impact sent a ripple through the barrier, its shimmering surface warping violently as cracks of silver light spidered outward. The tendril recoiled with a deafening hiss, but the force of the blow reverberated through the room, causing the air to shudder and Selene to stagger back, her breath catching as she struggled to hold the magic together. The barrier held, but Selene staggered, nearly falling to her knees. "Selene," Elyra called out, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," Selene said through gritted teeth, forcing herself upright. "Just keep them off Thorne." Jax exchanged a brief glance with Elyra, then turned his focus back to the fight. They just needed to hold out a little longer. The shard's light flared brighter, and he felt a surge of determination. They weren't going to lose this fight. Not here. Not now. Another tendril lashed out from the vortex, this time targeting the runes carved into the massive stone columns. The light in the room dimmed further, and the once steady hum of magic faltered, replaced by a low, ominous drone. Thorne's voice rose in urgency as he shifted his incantation, his hands trembling slightly under the strain. "If those runes collapse, the sanctum will be completely exposed," he warned, his voice hoarse. "We'll have no chance of holding them back." Elyra's eyes darted toward the columns, her fingers tightening on the bowstring. "I'll keep the runes clear," she said, loosing another arrow into the shadows. Her movements were precise, each shot finding its mark with practiced ease. Her expression hardened, a mix of fierce determination and unyielding focus, as if the chaos of the battle only sharpened her resolve. "Shadow, with me." The wolf obeyed without hesitation, darting toward one of the columns and lunging at a shadowy figure that had begun clawing at the intricate carvings. Elyra followed close behind, her movements quick but deliberate as she fired arrow after arrow. The sharp twang of her bowstring was a steady rhythm against the chaos of the fight. Jax focused on the vortex itself, using the shard to deflect the tendrils of energy that lashed out unpredictably. Each strike sent vibrations up his arm, the force of the impact threatening to knock him off balance. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, each step a battle against the oppressive magic radiating from the vortex. "Jax, behind you." Selene's warning came just in time. He spun around, bringing the shard up in a wide arc to block a blade of pure shadow aimed at his back. The light from the shard flared, and the attacker dissolved into a cloud of smoke. "Thanks," he said, his breath ragged. "How's Thorne holding up?" Selene's eyes flicked to the mage, who was now kneeling on the floor, his staff planted firmly in front of him. The runes along its length glowed like embers, bright and fierce, but his face was drawn tight with concentration. Thorne could feel the wards buckling under the weight of the corruption, each moment stretching his endurance to the limit. His mind raced through the layers of ancient magic, searching for stability in the chaos, even as exhaustion clawed at the edges of his focus. The runes along its length glowed like embers, bright and fierce, but his face was pale, and sweat dripped from his brow. "His holding," she said, though her tone was heavy with worry. "But he won't last much longer." Jax nodded grimly and turned his attention back to the fight. He had to trust that Thorne could finish his work before they were overwhelmed. The shard pulsed in his hand, its light unwavering despite the chaos around him. It was a small comfort, a reminder that they still had a chance, no matter how slim it seemed. The vortex roared again, and the tendrils of dark energy redoubled their assault. Jax braced himself, the shard blazing brightly as he prepared for the final push. "Hold the line," he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "We're almost there." Elyra's head snapped toward him, her jaw tightening as she loosed another arrow into the shadows. Selene, her breath labored, straightened her shoulders, the glow around her hands flaring brighter. Even Shadow seemed to respond, his growls deepening as he lunged at an encroaching foe. Jax's words carried more than urgency, they sparked a flicker of hope in the midst of chaos, drawing the group together for one final push. The clash of light and darkness painted the chamber in chaos. Tendrils of dark energy lashed out with reckless abandon, striking at the columns, the defenders, and the very air itself. Each tendril hissed as it tore through the space, the sound like steam escaping under pressure, and the air grew oppressively warm, carrying the faint smell of singed stone. Each strike sent vibrations rippling through the room, threatening to destabilize the fragile balance the group fought so hard to maintain. Jax swung the shard in an arc, its radiant energy colliding with a tendril that had veered dangerously close to Elyra. The impact sent sparks of light cascading across the floor, but the tendril reformed almost instantly, recoiling like a wounded predator preparing for another strike. "We can't keep this up," Jax yelled, his voice strained from exertion. His legs ached, every muscle burning from the relentless battle, and his chest heaved with the effort of drawing breath. The weight of the shard felt like a leaden anchor in his hand, its pulsing energy resonating with his frayed nerves. Despite the exhaustion clawing at him, his eyes burned with determination, refusing to let the chaos consume him. His grip on the shard was slick with sweat, the artifact's glow pulsing erratically as though responding to the chaos around it. Thorne, still kneeling near the vortex, gritted his teeth as he worked to stabilize the wards. His staff trembled under his grip, the runes along its length burning brighter as he muttered incantations under his breath. "I just need a little more time," he barked, his voice hoarse. "Time's not exactly on our side." Elyra shot back, loosing another arrow into the shadows. Her movements were sharp, precise, but there was a flicker of desperation in her eyes. Shadow darted between her and the encroaching figures, his silver fur streaked with ashen blood as he tore through their enemies with relentless ferocity. Selene stood near Thorne, her hands still raised as silver light radiated from her fingertips. The glow pulsed gently, casting elongated shadows across the chamber that danced and shimmered with each movement. The air around her seemed to hum, the light pushing back the oppressive darkness and leaving the faint scent of ozone in its wake. Every flicker of her magic felt like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding, a reminder of the fragile balance she fought to maintain. The protective barrier she had woven around the mage shimmered and pulsed, but cracks had begun to appear, faint fissures that widened with each impact from the vortex's tendrils. Her chants faltered for a moment as she glanced at Jax. "The corruption, it's growing. The vortex is feeding off the wards faster than we can counter it." Jax clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between the vortex and his companions. The shard in his hand burned with a fierce intensity, its power begging to be unleashed fully. He could feel it, an almost sentient urge within the artifact, urging him to act. But the last time he'd let the shard's power take control, the aftermath had been catastrophic. He couldn't risk losing himself again. "Jax." Selene's voice cut through his hesitation. "We need you." Her mind raced as she spoke, grappling with the enormity of their situation. Every fiber of her being screamed at the danger they faced, yet beneath the urgency, there was a flicker of doubt. What if this was too much to ask of him? What if he couldn't control the shard? Pushing her fears aside, she locked eyes with Jax, willing him to see the unwavering trust she placed in him despite the chaos that threatened to consume them all. His head snapped toward her, and for a moment, their eyes met. He saw the plea in her gaze, the unwavering trust she placed in him. With a deep breath, he nodded. "All right. But stay back. If this goes wrong." "It won't," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Jax stepped forward, the shard's glow intensifying as he directed its energy toward the vortex. The artifact responded eagerly, releasing a burst of radiant light that collided with the vortex's surface. The room trembled violently, and for a moment, the tendrils recoiled, writhing as though in pain. "It's working," Elyra called out, her voice tinged with hope. She loosed another arrow, her aim unerring as it struck one of the shadowy figures closing in on Thorne. "Keep it up." But the reprieve was short-lived. The vortex roared, a deafening sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with an ominous intensity, and the air felt as though it were being torn apart, sharp and electric. Jax winced as the force of the sound pressed against his chest, leaving his ears ringing and his balance wavering. Elyra stumbled, clutching at a column for support, while Selene's barrier shimmered erratically, strained under the relentless assault. The tendrils surged forward with renewed fury, targeting the shard directly. Jax staggered under the force of the attack, the artifact's light flickering wildly as it absorbed the brunt of the assault. Selene darted forward, her hands glowing brighter as she extended the protective barrier around Jax. "You can't take it all on yourself," she shouted, her voice strained from the effort. "Let us help." "I'm fine," Jax snapped, though his voice betrayed the strain he was under. The shard's power surged through him, wild and uncontained, threatening to overwhelm his senses. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. "Just keep them off me." Thorne's voice rose above the din, his incantation reaching its crescendo. The runes on his staff flared with a blinding light, and the ground beneath the vortex began to tremble. "I've almost got it," he shouted. "Just a little longer." Elyra and Shadow moved in unison, the archer's arrows flying in rapid succession as the wolf tore through the shadows with unrelenting ferocity. Celine's barrier flickered but held, her chants growing louder as she poured every ounce of her strength into protecting her friends. Jax took another step toward the vortex, the shard's light blazing as he unleashed another wave of energy. The vortex recoiled, its surface rippling violently. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they were gaining the upper hand. But then the vortex shifted, its tendrils coalescing into a massive form. The figure that emerged was humanoid, its body composed entirely of swirling dark energy, with eyes that burned like emerald flames. It stood tall, its presence dominating the chamber as it turned its gaze toward Jax. "So, this is the Shardbearer," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate in Jax's very bones. "You are strong, but strength alone will not save you." Jax tightened his grip on the shard, its light flaring in response to the figure's presence. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. The figure raised an arm, and a massive tendril of energy lashed out toward Jax. The tendril writhed like a living creature, its surface shifting between liquid and smoke, emanating an icy chill that seemed to sap the warmth from the air. It moved with predatory intent, leaving trails of dark mist in its wake, as though the very shadows clung to it. He raised the shard just in time, the artifact's light colliding with the attack in an explosion of energy that sent shockwaves rippling through the room. The force of the impact drove him to one knee, but he held his ground, refusing to falter. "Thorne!" Jax shouted, his voice strained. "Whatever you're doing, do it now." "I'm trying," the mage snapped, his hands trembling as he worked furiously to stabilize the wards. "Just keep it distracted." Jax gritted his teeth and pushed himself to his feet, the shard's light blazing as he faced the figure. His body screamed in protest, muscles trembling with exhaustion, but his mind burned with resolve. The fear that twisted in his gut clashed with an unyielding determination. He couldn't afford to falter now. The shard in his hand felt alive, its power surging like a heartbeat, urging him forward even as doubt whispered at the edges of his thoughts. "You want me? Come and get me." The figure didn't hesitate, lunging forward with the fluidity of a serpent. Its massive arm, wreathed in dark energy, swept across the chamber in a devastating arc. Jax barely rolled out of the way, the shockwave from the strike sending cracks spidering across the stone floor. The shard pulsed wildly in his hand, its glow surging with adrenaline-fueled power. Elyra took aim from the other side of the chamber, her arrow glowing with an intense blue light. "Jax, move!" she shouted, loosing the arrow at the figure's center mass. The projectile struck true, erupting in a flash of light that momentarily dispersed the shadowy form. But as the light faded, the figure began to reconstitute itself, its emerald eyes burning even brighter. "It's not enough," Celine murmured, her voice tinged with dread. She extended her hands, weaving another barrier around Jax as the figure lunged again. "The vortex, it's sustaining it. As long as it's active, we can't destroy it." Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. "Then we sever the connection." His staff flared, and the runes on the walls glowed faintly in response. "I can redirect the energy, but I need time, and a clear path." Jax's gaze locked on the figure, his mind racing. "Elyra, keep it distracted." "Celine, cover Thorne." Elyra gave a sharp nod, loosing another arrow as she darted to the side, drawing the figure's attention. Shadow leapt at its back, snapping at the tendrils of energy that snaked around its form. The wolf's teeth met resistance, but he growled fiercely, refusing to let go. Jax turned his focus to the shard, feeling its power coursing through him like a river of fire. He stepped toward the vortex, his heart pounding in his chest. The light from the artifact grew brighter with each step, illuminating the darkened chamber. "Whatever you're going to do it fast." Elyra shouted, narrowly dodging a swipe from the figure's massive arm. Jax reached the edge of the vortex, the air around him crackling with volatile energy. He raised the shard, channeling its power directly into the swirling mass. The vortex shrieked, its tendrils flailing wildly as the light from the shard began to destabilize its form. Thorne seized the moment, his voice rising in a powerful incantation. The runes around the chamber flared to life, their ancient symbols glowing with a searing brightness that pushed back the encroaching darkness. The room trembled violently as the energy from Thorne's spell surged toward the vortex, intertwining with the radiant light of Jax's shard. The shadowy figure recoiled, its form flickering and destabilizing as the connection between itself and the vortex began to fray. "No," it roared, its guttural voice shaking the walls. "You will not sever what has been forged." Jax gritted his teeth, forcing more energy into the shard. "Thorne, hurry. It's not going to hold much longer. I'm almost there." Thorne yelled back, his voice strained as he poured the last of his strength into the spell. The runes along his staff burned with an intensity that cast deep shadows across his face, and the air around him crackled with raw magic. Celine's barrier flickered, the strain evident on her face, but she refused to falter. "Jax, the shard, it's reacting to the wards. You have to synchronize with it, or we'll lose control." "I don't even know how," Jax shouted, the weight of the shard's power pressing harder against his will. But as the vortex let out another piercing shriek, something within him shifted. A clarity emerged, as if the shard itself were guiding him. "Trust it," Celine said softly, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Let it show you." Closing his eyes, Jax took a deep breath, focusing entirely on the shard. Its light grew steadier, pulsing in a rhythm that matched the tremors in the chamber. He could feel the artifact's connection to the vortex, a tangled web of energy that pulsed with malevolence. With a surge of determination, he pushed through the chaos, willing the shard to untangle the threads. The vortex shuddered violently, its tendrils flailing and retracting as the connection began to unravel. Pulses of dark energy exploded outward like bursts of liquid shadow, the air vibrating with an ominous hum. The light from the shard pierced through the chaos, each beam causing the tendrils to writhe in agony before collapsing into nothingness. A low, mournful wail echoed through the chamber, as if the vortex itself were crying out in its death throes, shaking the walls and leaving an acrid scent of burnt ozone in its wake. The shadowy figure let out an unearthly scream, its form disintegrating piece by piece as the light from the shard overwhelmed it. Thorne's voice boomed through the chamber, his final incantation reaching its peak. The runes on his staff erupted with searing light, cascading beams of energy into the air like streams of molten gold. The chamber itself seemed to vibrate in harmony with the spell, the walls reverberating as ancient symbols etched in the stone flared to life. Threads of raw magic spiraled outward, weaving into an intricate lattice that converged on the vortex, binding it in a radiant cage that shimmered and pulsed with unrelenting power. "Now, Jax. Finish it." Jax opened his eyes, the shard blazing with a brilliance that filled the room. His vision blurred momentarily, overwhelmed by the intensity of the light. Every muscle in his body felt taut, as though the energy of the shard was coursing through him like molten fire, leaving trails of both agony and exhilaration. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the weight of the artifact's power. For a fleeting moment, fear clawed at the edges of his mind, fear of losing control, of being consumed by the shard, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the purpose that drove him. The room seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, the shard's light synchronizing with his own resolve as he prepared to make the final, decisive move. With a shout, he thrust the artifact forward, releasing a torrent of energy that surged into the heart of the vortex. The light consumed everything, a blinding flash that swallowed the darkness whole. When the light faded, the chamber was eerily silent. The vortex was gone, its remnants dissipating into the air like wisps of smoke. The oppressive tension that had filled the room lifted, leaving behind a strange, almost eerie stillness. The air felt lighter, yet carried the faint scent of charred magic, a lingering reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. Even the faint echoes of their breaths seemed louder in the absence of the vortex's roar. The runes on the walls dimmed, their glow fading to a soft ember as the magic settled. Jax staggered, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Selene was at his side in an instant, her hand steadying him as he struggled to catch his breath. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. Thorne slumped against his staff, his face pale but triumphant. "The wards, they'll hold. For now." Elyra approached, shadow padding wearily at her side. She looked at Jax, her usual sharpness softened by a rare smile. "Not bad, Shardbearer. Not bad at all." Jax managed a weak grin, his gaze drifting to the shard in his hand. Its light had dimmed, but its presence was still strong, a reminder of the power they had just unleashed and the battles still to come. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but resolute. The words carried more than determination, they were a vow. Jax's mind churned with thoughts of what lay ahead, the trials they had yet to face, the enemies who would stop at nothing to see them fall. The shard in his hand pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power he wielded and the responsibility it demanded. Even as exhaustion threatened to pull him under, a spark of defiance burned within him, lighting the path forward in the darkness. Not by a long shot. The group exchanged weary glances, the weight of their victory tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. Together, they turned and made their way toward the exit, the echoes of their footsteps the only sound in the stillness of the ruined chamber. The air in the chamber had settled, but the tension among the group was far from dissipated. Thorne's breathing was shallow, his fingers trembling slightly as he gripped his staff like a lifeline. Elyra's sharp gaze darted around the room, her posture rigid with vigilance, while Shadow let out a low whine, his ears flicking nervously. Jax stood frozen for a moment, the shard glowing faintly in his hand as he fought to steady the storm of thoughts and emotions raging within him. Selene's expression was unreadable, but her eyes flickered with concern as she glanced between her companions, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on all of them like an invisible force. The faint glow of the runes on the walls cast long shadows, their once brilliant light reduced to a soft ember. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on everyone, heavier than the shattered debris littering the floor. Thorne leaned heavily on his staff, his shoulders slumping under the weight of exhaustion. The ancient runes along the length of the wood flickered dimly, their power spent. He wiped a hand across his face, smearing the soot that clung to his skin. "That was closer than I care to admit," he muttered. Elyra paced near the remnants of the vortex, her movements sharp and deliberate. Her bow hung loosely in her hand, but the tension in her posture made it clear she was still ready to act. Shadow trailed behind her, his gait slow and deliberate, his usually pristine coat streaked with blood and ash. She glanced at Jax, her expression a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "You're lucky that worked," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "If it hadn't." Jax's gaze remained fixed on the shard in his hand. Doubts swirled in his mind, each one louder than the last. Was he truly in control, or was the shard guiding him in ways he couldn't fully understand? The weight of responsibility bore down on him, heavier than the artifact itself. Memories of the battle flashed through his thoughts, the vortex's roar, the tendrils lashing out, the faces of his companions depending on him. He couldn't shake the nagging fear that next time, he might not have the strength to wield it, or worse, that it might wield him. The artifact felt heavier now, its light subdued but persistent, as if it, too, needed to recover. He didn't respond immediately, his thoughts too tangled in the aftermath of the battle. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Elyra's. "It did work," he said simply, his voice steady despite the lingering exhaustion. "That's all that matters." Selene approached him, her violet eyes scanning his face for any signs of strain. Her hands hovered near his arm, ready to steady him if he faltered. "You pushed yourself too far," she said softly. "The shard, it's more dangerous than any of us realized. You can't keep taking these risks." Jax shook his head, his grip tightening around the shard. "If I don't, who will?" His words carried a finality that left no room for argument. "This isn't just a tool, Selene. It's a responsibility. And I'm not going to let it control me. And if it does?" Thorne's voice was quieter now, but the weight of his question hung heavily in the air. "What happens if the shard's power becomes too much, Jax? We saw what it could do today. What it almost cost us." The room fell silent, the echoes of Thorne's words stretching into the stillness. Jax met the mage's gaze, his expression resolute. Then we find another way. But until then, this shard is our best chance to stop what's coming. We don't have the luxury of waiting for something safer. Elyra snorted, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. That's one way to look at it. Reckless, but at least you're consistent. Jax gave her a tired smirk. I'll take that as a compliment. Shadow let out a low growl, his ears swiveling toward the far end of the chamber. His body stiffened, muscles coiling like a spring ready to release. The fur along his spine bristled, and his tail lowered, signaling a readiness to fight or flee. His piercing gaze fixed on the darkness, unblinking, as a low, guttural sound escaped his throat, carrying a warning that something unseen was drawing near. Elyra immediately narked an arrow, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. "What is it, boy?" she murmured. Celine's hands began to glow faintly as she stepped closer to Jax. "We're not alone," she whispered. A figure emerged from the darkness, their movements deliberate and fluid. They were cloaked in shadow, their features obscured, but the faint green glow of their eyes betrayed their allegiance. "You have done well," the figure said, their voice smooth and cold. "But this is only the beginning." Jax stepped forward, the shard flaring faintly in his hand. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The figure tilted their head, their glowing eyes narrowing. "You know who I serve," they said, their voice dripping with contempt, each word drawn out as if savoring the weight of its menace. "And you know that this battle will not end with the destruction of a single vortex. Malaka's grasp reaches far beyond your comprehension, his power weaving into the fabric of existence itself. Malaka's reach is vast, his power immeasurable. What you have seen here is but a fraction of what is to come." Thorne stepped beside Jax, his staff raised, though it trembled slightly in his grasp. "If you serve Malaka, then you've already lost. This shard has power enough to end your master's plans." The figure laughed, a hollow sound that echoed ominously through the chamber. "You think that relic is enough? You are fools to place your hope in such fragile things. But no matter. The time will come when you will see the truth for yourselves." Before anyone could respond, the figure stepped back into the shadows, their form dissolving into the darkness as though they had never been there. The silence that followed was oppressive, the air itself seeming heavier in their absence. A faint chill crept into the chamber, and the flickering light from the runes cast uneasy shapes on the walls, twisting like specters in the periphery of their vision. Each breath felt louder, the sound amplified in the unnatural stillness, as if the figure's presence had left a void that the room itself struggled to fill. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of their words settling heavily on the group. Elyra lowered her bow, her expression unreadable. "Well, that's comforting," she said dryly. "We stop one catastrophe only to be told there's another one waiting for us." "It doesn't matter," Jax said firmly. He turned to face his companions, his expression hardening. "We'll deal with whatever comes next. Together." Celine stepped closer, her hand briefly brushing against his arm. "Together," she echoed, her voice steady. Thorne sighed, leaning heavily on his staff. "If we're to face what lies ahead, we need to prepare. The wards won't hold forever, and this shard." His voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. "Then we prepare," Jax said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We've made it this far. We're not giving up now." With a final glance around the ruined chamber, the group began to make their way toward the exit. The faint glow of the shard lit their path, its light steady and unwavering, a small beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jax allowed himself a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long, and the battles yet to come would test them all. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough. As the group emerged into the cold night air, the stars above seemed impossibly distant, their faint light doing little to chase away the lingering shadows. The remnants of the fortress loomed behind them, a testament to both their victory and the destruction left in its wake. Elyra ran a hand through her disheveled hair, glancing at the others. "Well, that's one hell of a way to end the day." She paused, her gaze softening as it fell on Shadow. "You okay, boy?" The wolf huffed softly, his ears twitching at the sound of distant rustling. Elyra followed his gaze toward the tree line, her instincts sharpening. We need to keep moving, she said, her tone more serious. I don't like the feel of this place. Jax nodded, gripping the shard tightly. Its faint warmth was a small comfort against the chill that had settled into his bones. She's right. If Malika's forces know what we've done, they won't waste time sending more. Selene glanced at the horizon, her expression unreadable. There's a village not far from here, she said. We can rest there, but we'll need to move before dawn. Thorne sighed heavily, his weariness evident in every step. Rest. That's a luxury I'd almost forgotten. He gave Jax a pointed look. Don't let your guard down. Not even for a moment. The trek to the village was silent, save for the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to their tongues. A damp, earthy scent wafted up from the ground, mingling with the acrid smell of burnt wood that lingered from the ruins behind them. The oppressive quiet pressed against their ears, making even the faintest sound seem unnaturally loud. The group's exhaustion was palpable, but an unspoken understanding kept them moving. They couldn't afford to stop, not yet. When they finally reached the edge of the village, it was eerily quiet. The houses were dark, their windows like hollow eyes watching their approach. Selene frowned, her hand drifting toward the hilt of her blade. Something's not right. Jax felt it too, a heaviness in the air, a tension that prickled at the edge of his awareness. He raised the shard, its light illuminating the path ahead. Stay close, he murmured, his voice low and steady, as though speaking too loudly might awaken something lurking in the shadows. The village seemed abandoned, but the absence of life only heightened the sense of unease. The buildings, once sturdy and proud, now sagged under the weight of neglect, their roofs warped and walls streaked with dark stains. Shattered windows gaped like empty eyes, offering glimpses of interiors choked with dust and decay. The cobblestone streets were uneven, overgrown with stubborn patches of weeds that whispered in the faint breeze. A faint smell of mildew and something acrid hung in the air, clinging to the back of their throats as they moved cautiously forward. Each step echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Shadow let out a soft growl, his ears flattening as he moved closer to Elyra, his body tense and ready. Are we sure this is the right place? Elyra whispered, her eyes darting from one darkened window to the next. Because it feels like we're walking into a trap. It's the right place, Selene said, her voice barely above a whisper. She extended a hand, the faint glow of her magic illuminating a weathered sign at the village's entrance. The name, carved into the wood, was barely legible beneath layers of moss and grime. But I don't think we're the first to arrive. Jax tightened his grip on the shard, its light growing brighter as though responding to his unease. Stay sharp, he said, glancing back at Thorne. Can you sense anything? The mage closed his eyes, his brow furrowing in concentration. The runes on his staff flickered weakly as he extended his awareness outward. After a long moment, he opened his eyes and shook his head. There's something, faint. Like an echo of magic, but it's not active. It feels old. Dormant. Dormant doesn't mean safe, Elyra muttered, her grip tightening on her bow. We should clear the area before we even think about resting. Jax nodded, motioning for the group to spread out. Stay within sight of each other. If anything moves, call out. The group fanned out cautiously, their movements slow and deliberate. Jax led the way toward the village square, the shard casting long, wavering shadows across the cobblestones. Selene followed closely, her magic ready at a moment's notice, while Elyra and Shadow took the perimeter, their sharp eyes and ears scanning for any sign of danger. Thorne lingered near the center, his staff held loosely in one hand as he muttered quiet incantations under his breath. The square was just as lifeless as the rest of the village. A broken fountain stood in the center, its once proud statue now little more than a crumbling silhouette. The water had long since dried up, leaving behind a bed of cracked stone and moss. Jax's gaze swept the area, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. There's nothing here, Selene said softly, though her tone was far from reassured. Nothing visible, Jax corrected. He stepped closer to the fountain, the shard's light illuminating faint etchings along its base. These symbols, they're wards. Or they were. The fact that they're broken means whatever protection this place once had is long gone. It's like leaving a gate wide open in a storm, anything could have come through unchecked. Thorne joined him, his eyes narrowing as he examined the markings. You're right. These were protective wards. Old ones. But they've been broken for years, maybe longer. Then why does this place still feel so wrong? Elyra asked as she rejoined the group, her bow drawn. It's like the air itself is watching us. Before anyone could answer, Shadow let out a sudden bark, his hackles rising as he turned toward the far end of the square. A figure stepped out of the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. They were cloaked in tattered robes, their face obscured by a deep hood. Who are you? Jax demanded, raising the shard. The figure paused, their head tilting slightly as if considering the question. When they finally spoke, their voice was raspy and hollow, like the wind through a cracked door. You should not be here. Yeah, well, we didn't exactly plan to stop by, Elyra said, her tone sharp. Who are you, and what happened to this village? The figure ignored her, their gaze, or what passed for it, fixed on Jax. The Shardbearer, they said, the words carrying a strange weight. You carry both hope and destruction in your hands. The title struck Jax like a physical blow, the weight of it settling heavily on his chest. Was he truly capable of balancing such opposing forces? Doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve, and yet, beneath it all, a spark of determination flared. He didn't choose this role, but he could choose how to wield the power it represented. His grip on the shard tightened, as if drawing strength from its faint glow. Do you even understand the power you wield? I'm learning, Jax said, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. But if you know what this is, then you know we're here to stop Malika. The figure laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. Stop him? You cannot stop what has already begun. Malika's reach extends far beyond what you can imagine. And you are but a pawn in a much larger game. Jax stepped forward, the shard blazing with renewed intensity. Then tell me what I don't know. The figure raised a hand, their fingers gnarled and skeletal beneath the folds of their robe. You will learn in time, Shardbearer. But beware. The choices you make will shape more than your own fate. They will echo across realms. With that, the figure stepped back into the shadows, their form dissolving into the night. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of the encounter settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Jax lowered the shard, his jaw tightening. We keep moving, he said firmly. Whatever that was, it's not stopping us. Selene touched his arm gently. And if they're right? About the choices we have to make. Jax met her gaze, his expression hardening. Then we'll make the right ones. Together. His words resonated in the quiet chamber, and each of them felt their resolve strengthen. Selene offered a small, determined nod, her magic glowing faintly as if responding to the unity in his tone. Elyra tightened her grip on her bow, her lips curving into a faint smile that spoke of grudging respect. Even Thorne straightened slightly, the weariness in his posture giving way to a glimmer of confidence. Shadow let out a low, approving growl, his tail flicking once before he padded closer to the group. They stood as one, bound by shared purpose and the unspoken promise to face whatever came next, together. The group exchanged weary glances before falling into step, the shard's light guiding them as they moved deeper into the unknown. Chapter 10. The gathering storm. The journey to the ancient ruins was a solemn one, the group's footsteps muffled against the forest floor as they moved deeper into the dense woods. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint, distant call of an owl. Though their battle with the vortex was behind them, its lingering effects were all too present. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the faint glow of the shard cast strange, shifting patterns against the trunks of ancient trees. Jax led the way, his hand tight around the shard's hilt. The artifact's faint pulse mirrored his own heartbeat, a constant reminder of its immense power and its potential cost. Behind him, Selene walked in silence, her violet eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Elyra kept to the rear, her bow at the ready, Shadow pacing beside her. The wolf's ears were perked, his movements tense, as if he, too, could sense the weight of the path ahead. Thorne's staff tapped rhythmically against the ground as he trudged forward, his once bright robes now dull and streaked with ash. His expression was thoughtful, his lips moving occasionally as if reciting spells under his breath. He had not spoken much since they had left the village, and the others respected his silence, knowing the gravity of what lay ahead. As the group crested a small hill, the ruins came into view. Bathed in the pale light of a waxing moon, the crumbling structures jutted out from the earth like jagged teeth. Ivy and moss clung to the stone walls, their surfaces carved with runes long since worn away by time. A chill breeze whispered through the clearing, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of ancient magic. The sight brought a momentary pause, each member of the group taking a breath before continuing down the slope. "It's been centuries since anyone set foot here," Thorne said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, his tone reverent. "The magic that lingers is old, older than the kingdoms themselves. Old magic or not, we need to stay sharp," Elyra said, her eyes fixed on the largest structure in the distance. "If we've learned anything by now, it's that nothing stays dormant forever." Selene nodded, stepping closer to Jax, her expression steady but her lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. She appeared confident on the surface, but a subtle tension in her eyes hinted at the worry she carried, a weight she did not let show in her voice. "We should approach carefully. There's no telling what might have been drawn here by the vortex's destruction. It's possible the shard's energy acted as a beacon." Jax glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The shard in his hand flared briefly, as if in response to her words. "Then we find out what's waiting," he said simply, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. The group moved into the clearing, their steps cautious and deliberate. The faint scent of damp moss lingered in the air, mingling with a metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. Pale moonlight filtered through gaps in the dense canopy above, casting jagged shadows that danced across the uneven ground. Every step seemed to echo in the stillness, amplifying the creak of a bowstring and the soft rustle of cloaks, as though the forest itself held its breath. Shadow was the first to pass the outer boundary of the ruins, his nose low to the ground, ears flicking at every sound. Elyra followed closely, her eyes sweeping the shadows for movement. Jax and Selene stayed in the center, with Thorne bringing up the rear, his staff faintly glowing in the dim light. The ruins were silent save for the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. A faint, acrid smell of decay lingered in the air, mingling with the ghostly hum of long-dormant magic. Each breath felt heavier, as though the very atmosphere pressed down on them, amplifying the sense of unease. The air felt thicker here, each breath carrying a weight that pressed against their chests. As they crossed the threshold of the first crumbling archway, Jax felt a shiver run down his spine. The shard pulsed more strongly now, its light casting sharp contrasts against the weathered stone. It was as if the artifact could sense something that the others could not. "Do you feel that?" Selene asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She froze mid-step, her eyes scanning the room as though trying to pinpoint a sound no one else could hear. A faint shiver ran through her, and her hands tensed slightly at her sides. Her eyes darted around the chamber they had entered, the remnants of walls and columns rising like the bones of a long-dead beast. "It's alive, somehow. The magic here isn't just lingering, it's waiting." Thorne nodded slowly, his hand tightening on his staff. "This place was once a center of power. It's not surprising that some remnants remain. But you're right, it's more than just residual energy. There's intent here." Elyra's arrow notched against her bowstring as she scanned the shadows. "If it's waiting, it's not for us to stumble around. We should move quickly, find what we came for, and get out." Jax held up a hand, his gaze fixed on a doorway at the far end of the chamber. The shard pulsed again, its glow intensifying. "Whatever's here, it's not going to let us leave without a fight. Be ready." The chamber ahead loomed larger than expected, its ceiling rising far above their heads and fading into darkness. The columns were etched with runes more intricate than any they'd seen before, faint glimmers of energy threading through the designs. Jax approached cautiously, his eyes scanning every corner for movement. Selene knelt by one of the columns, her fingers brushing the ancient carvings. Her brows furrowed in concentration as she traced the intricate lines, her movements deliberate. A faint tremor in her hand betrayed her apprehension, though her expression remained calm. As her fingers moved over the symbols, her lips tightened into a thoughtful line, hinting at the curiosity and unease she felt in the presence of such ancient, powerful markings. "These are wards," she said, her voice hushed. "Or they were. They've been dormant for centuries, but they could still reactivate if triggered." "Great," Elyra muttered, her eyes darting between the runes and the darkened alcoves that lined the walls. "Let's make sure we don't set off any ancient death traps, shall we?" Shadow sniffed the ground, his tail stiff as he moved further into the chamber. His fur bristled along his spine, and his movements became slower, more deliberate, as if each step was carefully measured. His ears flicked back briefly, then forward again, and his growl deepened, resonating with the unease that gripped the room. A faint growl rumbled from his throat as he stopped in front of a raised dais at the center. Jax followed his lead, his grip on the shard tightening as he approached. The artifact's light grew stronger, casting long shadows that danced along the cracked stone. "What is that?" Thorne asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. He gestured toward the object at the dais's center, a small pedestal, atop which rested a black crystal, faintly pulsing with its own dark energy. Jax hesitated, the shard flaring brighter as he stepped closer. His thoughts swirled with uncertainty. Was he pushing too far? The memory of their recent battle flashed in his mind, the risk he had taken, and the cost it might have exacted. But beneath the doubt, a glimmer of resolve emerged. The shard was dangerous, yes, but it was also their best chance at survival. As he stepped closer, he felt a surge of cautious confidence tempered by the weight of his responsibility, knowing full well what failure could mean. "It's connected to the shard," he said quietly. "I can feel it. But it's different, dark. It's like the opposite of what we've been carrying." "An inverse shard," Celine whispered, her eyes narrowing. The thought of another shard filled her with a conflicted mix of emotions. On one hand, the possibility intrigued her, an artifact that might counterbalance the power they carried. But it also sparked a deep sense of dread. If the shard they had was already so unstable, what would another, darker one do? The combination of excitement and fear made her pulse quicken, yet she kept her voice steady as she studied the ominous object. "If that's what it is, we can't let it stay here. It could be just as dangerous as the vortex." Thorne's expression hardened. "We have no idea what will happen if you take it. The shard we have is unstable enough. Adding another. We don't have a choice," Jax said firmly, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. He felt a pang of resignation, knowing the risk they were taking, but his determination shone through. This wasn't just a matter of survival, it was their only path forward, no matter the burden it placed on him. He stepped up to the dais, the light of the shard in his hand pulsing in rhythm with the black crystal. His companions held their breath as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through the room. Celine and Thorne instinctively raised their hands, preparing to shield the group from whatever might follow. Elyra dropped into a defensive stance, her bow at the ready, as Shadow let out a deep, warning growl. Jax braced himself against the sudden rush of power, feeling the shard in his hand flare brightly in response. The group stood frozen for a moment, the sheer force of the energy pinning them in place, their eyes flicking toward Jax for the next move. The runes on the columns flared to life, casting the chamber in a blinding light. The ground beneath them trembled, cracks spreading from the dais outward. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The vibration seemed to burrow into their bones, pressing against their ears and rattling their senses as it swelled to a nearly unbearable intensity. "Move!" Elyra shouted, pulling an arrow from her quiver and scanning the room for threats. Celine and Thorne scrambled back, their hands glowing as they prepared for whatever might come. Jax pulled the black crystal free, the shard in his hand blazing as it absorbed the dark energy. The force of it knocked him back, his body hitting the ground hard. Shadow darted to his side, growling as the tremors subsided. "Jax, are you all right?" Celine was at his side in an instant, helping him to his feet. His face was pale, but his grip on the shard was firm. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But something's coming. I can feel it." As if in response, a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The sound seemed to ripple through the group, freezing them in place for a moment. Jax tightened his grip on the shard, his knuckles white. Selene cast a quick glance at the others, her hands hovering near her spells. Elyra drew her bowstring taut, her breath quickening as she scanned the shadows. The growl made them all acutely aware of the peril they faced, sharpening their focus and readiness. The shadows at the far end of the room began to shift and coalesce, taking on a shape both alien and monstrous. Glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. Thorne stepped forward, his staff raised. "We have to stop it before it fully forms." "Selene, reinforce the wards." "Elyra, keep it distracted." Selene's hands moved in quick, precise patterns, the air around her crackling with energy as she tried to stabilize the runes. Elyra loosed an arrow, its glowing tip flying straight into the creature's form. The impact caused the shadowy mass to ripple, but it did not halt. Jax gripped the shard and the dark crystal tightly, feeling their opposing energies surging through him. He glanced at Selene, who was struggling to hold the wards together, and then at Elyra, who was preparing another shot. "We can't let this thing out of the chamber," he said, his voice steady. "If it gets free, we'll have another vortex on our hands, maybe worse." "Then we hold the line," Elyra said grimly, drawing her bowstring back. "And we don't let it through." Shadow snarled and leapt forward, his silver fur glinting in the light of the shard. The wolf's teeth sank into the shadowy mass, and the creature howled in response, its form fluctuating wildly. Jax took a step back, the shard flaring brighter as it seemed to absorb the creature's wailing cry. Elyra loosed another arrow, the glowing projectile piercing through the mass and causing it to shudder violently. The runes on the walls flickered, their light wavering under the strain. Selene's voice rang out over the chaos, her chants rising in volume. The air around her shimmered as a dome of light began to take shape, stretching outward and forcing the creature back. "Hold it steady," she shouted, her hands trembling as she struggled to keep the barrier intact. "I need just a moment longer." Thorne moved closer to Selene, his staff glowing as he added his own magic to the barrier. The combined effort pushed the creature further toward the chamber's far end, its form splintering into smaller tendrils that lashed out violently. Shadow lunged again, tearing through one of the tendrils before retreating to Jax's side, his growls low and steady. "We're running out of time," Elyra called out, her quiver almost empty. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Jax looked at the dark crystal in his hand, the shard in his other burning with fierce intensity. He knew he couldn't maintain both forces for long. Gritting his teeth, he raised the shard high, its light piercing through the gloom and flooding the chamber. The creature shrieked, its tendrils retracting as it writhed in pain. The ground shook, cracks spreading further as Jax directed the shard's energy into the center of the mass. "Selene, Thorne, reinforce it," he yelled, sweat dripping down his face. "Keep it contained until I can finish this." The two spellcasters poured their remaining strength into the barrier, its golden light solidifying around the creature and cutting off its escape. Elyra loosed her final arrow, hitting what appeared to be a central core within the mass. The creature let out one final, bone-chilling roar before collapsing inward, its energy drawn back into the shard. The chamber fell silent, save for the sound of labored breathing and the faint hum of the shard. Jax staggered, the black crystal crumbling into dust in his hand as its power dissipated. Selene reached out to steady him, her face pale but determined. "It's done," she said softly, though her voice carried an undertone of exhaustion. Thorne lowered his staff, the light fading from its runes as he slumped against a column. "For now." Elyra walked over, Shadow at her side, her bow lowered but still ready. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and frustration. "Every time we face something like this, it takes more out of us." Jax nodded, his hand trembling as he placed the shard back into its pouch. "I know. But if we don't?" He didn't finish the thought. They all knew the answer. They had no choice. The group gathered themselves, their gazes sweeping the ruined chamber one last time. The runes had gone dark, the oppressive energy gone, but the weight of their task still loomed heavy. They turned toward the exit, ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that this victory was only the beginning of the storm yet to come. The tension from the chamber lingered with them as they stepped into the dim corridor that stretched beyond the dais. The air was colder here, carrying the faint, sour tang of old magic. The chill seemed to cling to their skin, making them shiver as they moved forward. It was as if the very atmosphere resisted their presence, heavy with an unspoken warning. Jax took the lead, the shard in his hand still glowing faintly, casting long, flickering shadows against the damp stone walls. Every step echoed in the stillness, amplifying the group's unease. Each sound seemed to ricochet back at them, growing louder in their ears, until it felt as though the ruins themselves were listening. The echoes made them pause more frequently, their breaths growing shallower and their grips tightening on weapons as they fought the sense that they were not just alone, but unwelcome. Elyra was close behind him, her bow drawn, an arrow notched and ready. Shadow padded silently at her side, his ears twitching at every faint sound. Selene followed with Thorne bringing up the rear, the mage leaning more heavily on his staff than before. He looked paler, more drawn, his usual sharp demeanor softened by the exertion of their last encounter. "Do you think it's really over?" Elyra asked, her voice a low murmur. Her eyes flicked to Jax, then to Selene. Whatever that thing was, did we actually destroy it, or just push it back? Jax glanced over his shoulder. "We stopped it from forming completely. That's all we needed to do. For now." He didn't sound convinced, but there was no time for second-guessing. "Not here." The corridor led them deeper into the ruins, the passage twisting and turning as if trying to confuse any intruders. The runes on the walls, long dormant, occasionally flickered as they passed, as if recognizing the shard's presence. Thorne muttered under his breath as he glanced at the inscriptions. "These writings, they're older than anything I've studied before," Thorne said, his voice carrying a mix of awe and concern. The reverence in his tone suggested a deep respect for the ancient knowledge, yet there was a tension there, an undercurrent of unease at what might come next. "And they're responding to us. To the shard. Is that a good thing?" Selene asked, her voice steady but tinged with caution. "That depends on what they're saying," Thorne replied, squinting at a particularly ornate set of symbols. "But it's likely the shard is waking the old defenses. We should expect more resistance the further we go." "Wonderful," Elyra muttered. "Because I really wanted more surprises today." The group pressed on, their steps growing more cautious. The corridor began to widen, and soon they entered another chamber, larger than the one before. At the far end, a massive archway loomed, its surface etched with intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the shard's light. The room itself was eerily empty, the floor strewn with fragments of stone and ancient, rusted metal. Shadow's low growl broke the silence, his stance lowering as he stared at the archway. His fur bristled, his tail drooping slightly as he shifted closer to Elyra's side. His eyes stayed fixed on the archway's dark center, and the rumble in his throat deepened, resonating in the stillness like a warning bell. Jax stepped forward, his grip on the shard tightening. "That's where we need to go," he said quietly. "What makes you so sure?" Elyra asked, her bow still raised. "The shard," he replied. "It's pulling me toward it. I can feel it." Selene placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Wait. Something's wrong." Before Jax could respond, the archway flared to life, its radiance flooding the chamber in a wave of searing brilliance. The light burned so intensely that it felt almost tangible, a pressure against their skin and a stabbing glare that made their eyes water. The carvings on its surface lit up in a blinding cascade of colors, the runes spinning and shifting as a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. The group staggered back as a wave of energy rippled outward, forcing them to shield their eyes. When the light dimmed, the archway shimmered with a translucent barrier, and within that barrier, a figure began to take shape. It was humanoid, but only barely. Its form flickered and warped, as if it were caught between two states of being. Eyes that burned with an otherworldly light locked onto Jax, and a voice that seemed to echo from all directions spoke. "You should not be here." The group froze, their weapons at the ready. Selene's fingers began to glow as she prepared a spell. "Who are you?" she demanded. The figure's head tilted, its voice turning cold and precise. "I am a guardian. A sentinel of this place. And you carry the shard. It is forbidden." We don't have a choice, Jax said firmly. He stepped forward, the shard blazing brighter in his hand. We're here because we have to be. Stand down, or we'll force our way through. The Guardian's form steadied, its flickering edges sharpening. You cannot force what was never meant to be moved, the Guardian said, its voice a chilling mix of stern authority and quiet menace. The weight of its words hung in the air, each syllable infused with an undeniable warning. The shard is a fragment of balance, and you are disrupting the order. Leave now, or be destroyed. Elyra's arrow was already narked, her fingers tightening on the string. What's the call, Jax? We're going through, he said without hesitation. Everyone, get ready. The Guardian raised a hand, and the room plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was no sound but the hum of the shard. Then the ground beneath them began to shift, the fragments of stone and metal rising into the air. They coalesced into shapes, jagged constructs that hovered menacingly, glowing with the same light as the runes on the archway. Shields! Thorne shouted, slamming his staff into the ground. A dome of shimmering energy rippled outward, forming a glowing barrier that crackled faintly with power. The air inside felt slightly warmer, almost protective, but there was no mistaking the sense of urgency in Thorne's voice. A shimmering barrier spread out around the group, deflecting the first wave of the construct's attacks. Celine's hands moved in a flurry, her magic weaving into the barrier to reinforce it. Elyra loosed an arrow, the glowing projectile striking one of the constructs and shattering it into shards of light. We've got more incoming, she called, already aiming at another target. Jax stepped forward, the shard's light pushing back the darkness. He could feel its energy coursing through him, guiding him. Keep them off me, he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. I'm going to break through the barrier. Celine nodded, her spells spinning faster as she held the constructs at bay. Her expression was one of focused determination, her brow furrowed as she poured every ounce of strength into maintaining the barrier. Shadow leapt forward, his teeth sinking into one of the jagged forms, and it dissolved in a burst of light. Thorne's staff glowed brighter, a beam of energy slicing through another construct. Jax focused on the archway, the shard in his hand blazing like a star. He could feel the Guardian's presence, its resistance pressing against him. But he also felt the shard's will, a sense of purpose that refused to yield. He took a step closer, then another, and with each step the barrier flickered and weakened. The Guardian's voice boomed. You will not pass. Jax raised the shard high, its light pouring out in a blinding wave. The barrier shuddered, the constructs around them disintegrating one by one. The hum of the chamber grew louder, more chaotic, until finally, with a resounding crack, the barrier collapsed. The Guardian let out a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a roar, and then it was gone. The archway stood open, the runes fading to a faint glow. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. Is it over? Elyra asked, lowering her bow. Jax nodded, though his hand trembled as he lowered the shard. For now. Celine stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the now open archway. Whatever's beyond there, it's not going to let us leave without a fight. We'll deal with it, Jax said firmly, his voice steady and commanding, though there was a faint undertone of fatigue that betrayed the toll the battle had taken. Let's keep moving. The group gathered themselves, their steps wary but determined, and passed through the archway into the unknown. They stepped into a cavernous space that seemed to stretch far beyond what the ruins above suggested. Their footsteps echoed faintly, each sound reverberating into the distance before fading. The air itself felt dense, as though the walls absorbed and softened any noise, leaving a hushed, almost reverent atmosphere. Columns rose high into the shadows, their surfaces carved with ever more intricate runes that glimmered faintly. The floor beneath their boots was smooth, polished stone, veined with glowing lines of energy that pulsed rhythmically. It felt as if the entire room was alive, breathing in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the hum of the shard. Elyra kept her bow raised, her eyes darting between the runes and the darkened corners of the space. This isn't just a ruin, she muttered. It's something more. Something alive. Thorne nodded, though his expression was grim. These runes, this architecture, it's designed to channel magic, not just contain it. We're standing in the heart of an ancient power source. And it's still active. Celine knelt beside one of the glowing lines on the floor, her fingers hovering over the energy but not quite touching it. "It's not just active," she said quietly. "It's reacting to us. To the shard." Shadow growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back as he watched the far side of the room. Jax followed the wolf's gaze and saw movement, faint shapes shifting in the gloom. His grip tightened on the shard as he took a step forward. "We're not alone." The air grew heavier, the pulsing energy from the floor intensifying. The faint shapes began to take form, coalescing into figures that looked almost human, though their bodies were composed of the same glowing lines that traced the room. They moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, their faces featureless save for the intense light that burned where eyes should have been. "They don't look friendly," Elyra said, her voice taut. One of the figures stepped forward, its head tilting as if studying them. The light in its eyes flared briefly, and then it spoke. The voice was strange, both deep and resonant, as though the room itself were speaking through it. "You bring imbalance. The shard does not belong here. Leave, or be unmade." Jax held his ground, the shard glowing brighter in his hand. "We're not leaving. We have a purpose here." The figures didn't move for a moment, but then the one who had spoken raised a hand. The air around them shifted, the glowing lines on the floor surging with energy. The other figures began to advance, their movements deliberate and synchronized. "Get ready," Jax called, stepping back into a defensive stance. Elyra let loose an arrow, the projectile striking one of the figures and causing it to flicker, but not fall. Shadow lunged forward, jaws snapping as he intercepted another. Celine's hands moved quickly, casting a barrier around the group as Thorne began a chant, his staff glowing as he prepared a counterattack. The figures surged forward, their forms glowing brighter as they attacked. Each blow from their glowing limbs sent shockwaves through the air, but the group held their ground. Jax swung the shard in a wide arc, its light cutting through one of the figures and causing it to shatter into fragments of energy. Elyra's arrows found their marks with precision, each one slowing the advance just enough for Thorne's spells to take effect. Shadow moved like a silver blur, striking and retreating before the figures could respond. Celine's barrier pulsed, deflecting a powerful blast from one of the figures. She grit her teeth, her focus unwavering as she reinforced the shield. "We can't keep this up forever," she called. "They're feeding off the energy in the room." Jax's mind raced. He could feel the shard responding to the room's power, drawing it in. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a key. If he could harness it, perhaps he could shut down the source of these attackers entirely. But to do so would require him to channel the shard's power in a way he hadn't attempted before, something deeper, more dangerous. "Keep holding them," he shouted over the din. "I need time." The team tightened their formation, backing toward one of the massive columns. Elyra's arrows flew with precise fury, each shot buying precious seconds. Celine poured her magic into the barrier, her face pale from the strain, while Thorne muttered a complex spell, his voice rising as a wave of light lashed out and momentarily stalled the advancing figures. Shadow, undeterred, lunged at a glowing figure that came too close, his jaws snapping down with fierce determination. Jax gripped the shard with both hands and focused. The runes on the columns responded, flaring with a harsh, white light that illuminated the entire chamber. He felt the shard resonate, connecting with the energy lines in the floor and the carvings on the walls. Slowly, he began to turn the energy inward, forcing it to retreat back into the stone and away from their assailants. The figures faltered, their movements slowing. Their glowing forms flickered, and the light in their eyes dimmed. Celine noticed the shift, her lips pressing into a grim smile. "It's working. Whatever you're doing, keep going." Sweat dripped down Jax's temple as he pushed harder. The shard blazed, flooding the room with a pulse of energy that sent the remaining figures crumbling into sparks. The runes on the walls dimmed, and the oppressive hum faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. As the last glimmer of light dissipated, Jax lowered the shard, his arms trembling. He turned to see his team, battered, exhausted, but alive. Celine reached out, steadying him as he swayed. "Is it over?" Elyra asked, her voice raw. "For now," Jax said, his voice firm despite the weariness in his eyes. "But we can't stay here." Whatever that was, it wasn't the end. There's more waiting ahead. The group exchanged grim nods, their unity unshaken. Together, they pressed onward into the labyrinthine depths, ready to face whatever trials awaited them next. The path ahead wound downward, twisting and narrowing as it led deeper into the ancient structure. The cool, damp air clung to their skin, carrying the faint, metallic tang of old magic. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, the sound amplified in the stillness. The oppressive atmosphere heightened their unease, each step making the shadows seem more alive. The light of the shard cast strange patterns on the walls, illuminating carvings and runes that grew more elaborate and more sinister the farther they traveled. It was as if the very stone was warning them to turn back. Elyra moved closer to Jax, her voice low and sharp, her brow furrowed and her movements tense. Her cautious glances at the darkened corridor ahead and the tightening of her grip on the bow revealed her growing unease. "I don't like this. It feels like the walls are closing in." Jax glanced back, his jaw set. "They might be." Thorne ran his fingers along a series of symbols etched into the wall, his expression shifting from grim determination to a faint awe. The intricate carvings seemed to hold more than just warnings. There was an artistry that captured his attention, a sense that whoever had etched these runes understood the delicate balance between destruction and preservation. Despite the danger they hinted at, Thorne couldn't help but feel a reluctant admiration for their creators. His expression was grim. These runes aren't just decorative. They're a record. A history of what happened here, and a warning of what will happen again if we continue. Selene stopped beside him, her eyes narrowing as she studied the carvings. A faint crease appeared between her brows, hinting at a blend of curiosity and unease. Her gaze flicked from one symbol to the next, as if trying to piece together a puzzle whose answer eluded her. She took a slow, measured breath, her body tense yet controlled. "What do they say?" Thorne hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "They speak of a great unbinding. A power that was once contained, then unleashed. It cost them everything to seal it away again." "Unbinding?" Elyra repeated, her fingers tightening on her bow. "That sounds promising." Selene turned to Jax. "The shard could be the key to containing it again, but it could also be what it's waiting for. We need to be careful." Jax nodded, but his gaze was fixed on the path ahead. "We don't have a choice. Whatever it is, we have to face it." They moved on in tense silence. The air grew heavier, carrying a faint, acrid smell that made their eyes water. Shadow's growl was low and constant now, his silver fur bristling. The wolf pressed closer to Elyra's side, his movements cautious, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The corridor widened into a vast chamber, the ceiling disappearing into shadows far above. Pillars of dark stone rose around them, their surfaces etched with glowing lines of energy that pulsed in time with the shard's light. At the center of the room, a pedestal stood, its surface polished smooth. On it rested a large crystal, dark and motionless, but exuding a palpable force that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. Thorne's breath caught. "That's it. That's what's been pulling us here." Jax took a cautious step forward, his hand tightening around the shard. His shoulders straightened, and he drew in a slow, deliberate breath. His eyes darted back briefly toward the others, ensuring they were still close behind before returning his focus to the pedestal ahead. The light from the artifact flared brighter, and the crystal seemed to respond, faint ripples of energy coursing through it. The room vibrated softly, a low hum resonating through the air. "Stay close," Jax said. "I don't know what's going to happen, but we need to be ready." Selene nodded, her hands already glowing as she prepared a spell. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her expression calm yet intensely focused on the task at hand. Elyra moved to cover the room's entrance, her bow drawn. Thorne began muttering under his breath, the runes on his staff flickering to life. Shadow crouched low, his eyes locked on the crystal, his ears flat against his skull. As Jax approached the pedestal, the crystal shuddered. A sound like a deep exhale filled the chamber, and the energy in the room intensified. The glowing lines on the pillars brightened, and the vibrations grew stronger. The crystal cracked, a hairline fissure running along its surface, and a voice echoed through the chamber, low, resonant, and ancient. "You have come to undo what was done, to awaken what sleeps. Jax froze, his grip tightening on the shard. We've come to stop whatever it is you are. The voice laughed, a deep, hollow sound. You carry the key, and yet you seek to deny its purpose. Such contradiction, such futility. Selene stepped forward, her voice firm. What are you? What do you want? I am the binding and the bound, the voice said. I am the chain and the freed. And you are the ones who will decide. The crystal cracked again, the fissure widening. Shadows began to coalesce around it, forming into shapes, figures that resembled the constructs they had faced earlier, but more solid, more deliberate. The air grew colder, the acrid smell intensifying. Elyra fired an arrow, the glowing projectile striking one of the shapes with a sharp, crackling sound. The shape wavered, its edges shimmering before it dispersed into a curling plume of dark smoke that faded into the air. But more began to form, their movements slow and deliberate, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. Here we go again, Elyra muttered, narking another arrow. Hold them off, Jax shouted, stepping closer to the pedestal. The shard in his hand burned bright, and the shadows recoiled slightly, as if wary of its light. Selene and Thorne began casting, their spells weaving a protective barrier around the group. Shadow leapt at one of the figures, his teeth snapping at its shifting form. Elyra's arrows flew, her movements quick and precise, but the shadows kept forming, growing more numerous. Jax focused on the crystal, the shard's light pouring into it. The fissures widened, light spilling from within as the room trembled. The voice grew louder, its tone shifting from amusement to urgency. Do you understand what you are doing? Do you know the cost? We know the cost if we don't, Jax said through gritted teeth, his voice a mix of defiance and fatigue, a reflection of the heavy burden he carried. This ends here. The crystal shattered, a wave of light and sound erupting from it. The figures dissolved, their forms breaking apart into motes of energy that faded into the darkness. The glowing lines on the pillars dimmed, the vibrations ceased, and the room fell silent. Jax staggered back, the shard's light returning to its steady glow. Selene caught him as he stumbled, her expression relieved but wary. Elyra lowered her bow, her breaths coming fast and uneven. Thorne leaned heavily on his staff, his eyes fixed on the now empty pedestal. Is it over? Elyra asked, her voice rough. For now, Jax replied. But whatever that was, it's not the last we'll see of it. Selene nodded. The runes spoke of a cycle. Binding, unbinding, and binding again. We stopped it for now, but we need to be ready for what comes next. Jax straightened, his grip on the shard firm. Then let's keep moving. There's still more ahead. With weary steps, the group left the chamber, the shadows behind them fading into stillness once more. The air outside the chamber felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Yet a faint unease lingered, a subtle tension in the back of their minds that reminded them the danger was not truly gone. As they stepped into the next corridor, the air was even heavier, laden with a metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. The walls here were smooth, almost polished, reflecting the faint light of the shard in strange, disorienting patterns. Shadow growled low in his throat, his silver fur bristling as he pressed closer to Elyra's side, his tail lowered and his movements deliberate, as if ready to leap at the first sign of danger. Why does it feel like we're walking into a trap? Elyra muttered, her grip on her bow tightening. Because we probably are, Thorne said grimly. He ran a hand along the polished stone, his fingers brushing against faint etchings that seemed to shimmer in the shard's glow. This isn't just stone. It's infused with some kind of binding magic. Whatever's ahead, it's powerful enough to warrant all of this. Selene nodded, her eyes scanning the corridor's ceiling for any signs of traps or defenses. Stay close. If we encounter another guardian, we'll need to be ready. Jax kept his gaze fixed ahead, the shard pulsing steadily in his hand. He could feel its pull, guiding him deeper into the labyrinth. We keep moving, he said, his voice firm. If we hesitate, we're giving whatever's here more time to react. The corridor opened into another chamber, smaller than the last but no less foreboding. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding a faintly glowing crystal that pulsed in sync with the shard. In the center of the room, a raised platform held a single pedestal, its surface etched with runes that seemed to twist and shift as they looked at them. "This feels like a test," Thorne said, his voice low. Selene stepped forward cautiously, her hand outstretched toward the nearest alcove. "These crystals, they're connected to the shard. But they're also tethered to something deeper. If we can understand their pattern, we might be able to." Before she could finish, the room shuddered. The crystals flared, their light intensifying as a deep hum filled the air. Shadow barked sharply, his fur bristling as the alcoves began to shift. The glowing stones moved outward on unseen mechanisms, forming a ring around the platform. Elyra stepped back, her bow raised. "Here we go again." A voice echoed through the chamber, similar to the one they'd heard before but layered with an almost mocking tone. "You proceed deeper. Yet do you comprehend what you awaken? Each step you take unravels the bindings. Each step brings you closer to destruction." "We don't have a choice," Jax called out, stepping forward. "If we don't stop this, it's only going to spread. We're here to seal it once and for all." The light from the shard flared as if in response to his words. The ring of crystals pulsed brighter, and from the walls emerged new figures, humanoid shapes composed of light and shadow, their forms flickering as they approached. This time, they carried weapons, glowing blades that hummed with energy. "Selene, Thorne, get the barrier up," Jax shouted, gripping the shard tightly. "Elyra, cover the left." The room erupted into chaos. Selene and Thorne raised a shimmering barrier around the group, the glow of their combined magic pushing back against the advancing constructs. Elyra's arrows flew with precision, each shot disrupting one of the figures long enough for Shadow to dart in and strike. Jax stepped onto the platform, the shard in his hand blazing. The runes on the pedestal shifted rapidly, their glow growing chaotic. He could feel the power building, resonating with the shard. "There's a sequence," he muttered. "A pattern we need to follow." Selene's voice was strained as she maintained the barrier. "Then figure it out quickly." Thorne's staff pulsed as he directed bursts of energy at the constructs, momentarily slowing their advance. "The crystals. They're reacting to the shard's light. Jax, try aligning the shard with the runes on the pedestal." Jax nodded, his brow furrowed as he moved the shard over the glowing runes. As he did, the patterns began to stabilize, their chaotic flickering slowing. The constructs hesitated, their movements growing sluggish as the light from the shard began to overpower their own. Elyra fired another arrow, her voice sharp. "They're still coming. Whatever you're doing, it's not fast enough." Jax gritted his teeth, focusing all his energy into the shard. The runes on the pedestal flared brightly, and the light from the surrounding crystals converged on the platform. A surge of energy pulsed through the room, throwing the constructs back and causing the barrier to shimmer with intensity. When the light faded, the constructs were gone, their forms dissolved into the air. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the crystals, which now pulsed gently, their light soft and steady. Jax lowered the shard, his shoulders sagging. "It's done. For now." Selene let out a breath, her hands dropping as the barrier dissipated. Thorne leaned heavily on his staff, his face pale. Elyra lowered her bow, glancing warily at the crystals. "What did you do?" she asked. Jax looked at the pedestal, its runes now faint and steady. "I aligned the shard's light with the runes. It stabilized the energy here, for now. But we need to keep moving." Selene nodded, her voice calm despite her exhaustion. "The deeper we go, the more resistance we'll face. But this is the only way." With a final glance at the chamber, the group moved toward the next corridor, their steps heavy but determined. They knew the trials ahead would only grow more intense, but the shard's light still guided them forward, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Jax's steps faltered as they reached the edge of a cavernous hall. His breath caught at the sight of a vast, circular chamber, its walls lined with massive, intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the light of the shard. The chamber's air was chill, and the carvings seemed to absorb the light, reflecting it in fragmented patterns that danced like specters on the smooth stone floor. At the center of the chamber stood an enormous crystalline structure, taller than any of them, its many facets catching the shard's light and refracting it into thousands of shards that danced on the walls. "This must be it," Selene murmured, her voice tinged with awe. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening as they traced the glowing carvings on the walls. She took a slow step forward, her movements cautious yet drawn by the chamber's overwhelming presence, as if a mix of wonder and unease rooted her to the spot. Her violet eyes scanned the walls, tracing the patterns of runes and symbols. This is the source. Thorne tightened his grip on his staff, his face pale but resolute. Then we know what we have to do. Elyra moved closer to the group, her bow at the ready. Anyone want to bet it's not going to let us just walk up and take it down? The faint hum of the crystalline structure grew louder as they approached, the vibrations reverberating in their chests. The sound pulsed in rhythm with the shard's glow, each thrum pressing against their ears and settling heavily in their bones. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift, rippling as though they were alive, their patterns twisting and reforming in an eerie, almost hypnotic dance. Some sections pulsed with faint, shifting colors, as if the stone itself had drawn breath and begun to stir. Shadow growled low in his throat, his fur bristling as he pressed against Elyra's side. "We need a plan," Jax said, his voice steady but his hand tight around the shard. "Whatever this thing is, it's not just going to sit there. And if those carvings start coming alive, we're in trouble." Thorne stepped forward, his gaze locked on the crystal. His eyes flickered with a mix of caution and determination, his movements steady but deliberate. The faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his reverence for the object before him, as if he understood its power and the risks it posed. The runes here suggest it's tied to multiple anchors, possibly in those alcoves on the perimeter. If we can disrupt those, it might weaken the core. Or it might trigger whatever defense mechanism is waiting to kill us, Elyra muttered. Celine's lips pressed into a thin line. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, and her hands shifted, one lifting slightly as if preparing to cast a spell. The tension in her stance suggested she was ready to act at the first sign of danger. "We don't have another option." Thorne's right. "We break the anchors, and then we deal with the core." Jax glanced around the chamber, taking in the towering walls and the faint, shifting glow of the carvings. He nodded. "Elyra, Shadow, cover our flanks. Celine, Thorne, you're on the anchors. I'll handle the core." Celine's gaze snapped to him. "You can't handle it alone. That thing is resonating with the shard, and whatever happens when it breaks loose, it'll go straight for you." "I know," Jax said quietly, meeting her eyes. "But that's why you have to take care of the anchors. If I can keep it distracted, you'll have enough time to finish." Thorne's brow furrowed. "That's a lot of pressure to put on one person, Jax." "If something goes wrong, then it's on me," Jax interrupted. He held the shard tightly, its glow pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "This is what I signed up for. You just focus on getting those anchors down." A heavy silence fell over the group. Then Celine nodded. "All right. But you call for help the moment it's too much." "Deal," Jax said, a faint smile touching his lips. He turned to face the core, the light of the shard brightening as he stepped forward. Behind him, the others moved quickly to their positions, their footsteps echoing faintly in the cavernous space. As Jax approached the crystalline structure, the hum intensified. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest and making each breath more difficult. The shard in his hand felt alive, almost too hot to hold, as though it was eager to meet the power in the core. Celine and Thorne reached the first anchor, a tall, intricately carved pillar glowing faintly blue. Thorne began muttering an incantation, the runes on his staff glowing brighter as he poured energy into the structure. Celine's hands moved quickly, tracing patterns in the air that sent ripples of violet light over the anchor. The pillar flickered, the blue glow faltering slightly, but it held firm. "Something's resisting," Celine said, her tone clipped. "It's not going to go down easily." "We'll make it," Thorne replied, his voice steady. "Focus." Across the chamber, Elyra loosed an arrow into the shadows as a faint movement caught her eye. The glowing projectile illuminated a figure, one of the shadowy constructs from before, its form now solidified, its dark, shifting surface reflecting a dim light. Its movements were smoother, more deliberate, as though it had gained a measure of intelligence. Each step it took sent ripples through its inky form, and its glowing eyes seemed fixed on the group with an unsettling, predatory focus. Shadow growled and charged, his teeth snapping at the figure's legs as Elyra fired another shot. "They're coming!" Elyra shouted, her voice ringing out over the rising hum of the core. The urgency in her tone carried an edge of defiance, a determination to hold the line against the encroaching danger. "We've got company." Celine's focus faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her concentration, pouring more energy into the anchor. The pillar trembled, cracks forming along its surface as the blue glow began to fade. Jax reached the core, the shard in his hand flaring brilliantly. The crystalline structure seemed to react, its facets shifting and changing as though it were alive. A deep, resonant voice filled the chamber, the words indistinct but carrying a palpable weight. The light from the core grew blinding, forcing Jax to shield his eyes. "Whatever you're doing, hurry," Jax called out, his voice strained, his stance shifting slightly as he adjusted his grip on the shard, clutching it tightly against the growing heat. Celine's spells intensified, the violet light cutting deeper into the anchor. Thorne raised his staff high, a burst of golden energy slamming into the pillar. With a sharp crack, the first anchor shattered, its blue glow extinguished. "First anchor down," Celine shouted. She and Thorne rushed toward the next pillar, their movements urgent. Elyra fired another arrow, the glowing projectile striking true. The construct wavered, its form rippling before it collapsed into smoke. Shadow darted back to Elyra's side, his growl steady as more figures emerged from the shadows. "Keep them off," Celine called over her shoulder. One more anchor to go. As the group fought and worked, the core's light grew fiercer. Jax felt the shard's heat searing through his palm. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the crystalline structure. He could feel it fighting back, a force unlike anything he had faced before. It pressed into his mind, testing his resolve, and for a moment, he wavered. The sound of shattering stone brought him back. The second anchor fell, its glow fading into darkness. Celine and Thorne turned toward the core, their combined magic forming a protective shield around Jax as he took another step forward. The shard blazed, and the core's hum rose to a deafening pitch. "Now!" Thorne shouted. "Break it, Jax." Jax raised the shard high, its light burning like a star. He poured every ounce of energy he had into the crystalline structure, feeling the resistance crack and crumble under the onslaught. The core emitted a soundless scream, its light splintering into 1,000 shards that flew outward, illuminating the chamber in a final, blinding flash. When the light faded, the room was still. The towering crystalline structure was gone, its power dispersed. The air around them felt noticeably lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted, though a faint hum lingered, a subtle reminder of the energy that once dominated the chamber. The carvings on the walls dimmed to darkness, and the oppressive weight lifted. Jax lowered the shard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Celine and Thorne reached his side, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. Elyra and Shadow approached cautiously, the glow of Elyra's arrows dimming as she relaxed her bow. "Is it over?" Elyra asked, her voice hushed. Jax nodded. "For now." The group stood together in the center of the silent chamber, the shard's light casting faint shadows on the walls. They knew this victory was only one step in a much larger battle, but for now, they allowed themselves a moment to breathe. As the last echoes of the core's destruction faded, the group stood in uneasy silence. The walls that once thrummed with energy were now still, their intricate carvings seemingly devoid of life. The air hung heavy, though the oppressive pressure that had weighed on them earlier was gone. Jax turned the shard over in his hands, its surface duller now, the light within steady but subdued. The heat it once radiated had cooled, leaving behind only the faint pulse that matched his heartbeat. He looked to the others, their faces etched with a mix of relief and lingering tension. Celine approached him, her violet eyes scanning the shard. "It's quieter now." The connection to the core must have been what made it so unstable. He nodded. "That's my guess too. But it doesn't feel over. Whatever this place was hiding, I think we only scratched the surface." Thorne sighed, leaning heavily on his staff. "We've stopped the immediate threat, but the runes we passed earlier suggested there are deeper levels to this. We've taken out the heart, but if the foundations are still intact, something else could rise to take its place." Elyra looked toward the passage they came from, her bow lowered but still in hand. And you're saying we should head even deeper into this place? Seems like we barely got out of that fight alive. Celine's gaze turned thoughtful. If we leave now, we'll always wonder what's still down there. We have the shard. We have a chance to end whatever this cycle is once and for all. But we need to decide, are we ready for another fight? Jax rubbed his temple, exhaustion pulling at him. The idea of delving deeper into the unknown tugged at him, a mix of responsibility and dread. He knew they were not at their strongest, yet the lingering weight of what they might leave behind urged him on. Celine placed a hand on his shoulder. We've come this far. If we stop now, everything we've fought for could be undone. Elyra sighed, slinging her bow over her shoulder. I still think this is insane. But if you all are going, I'm not staying behind. Someone has to keep you alive. Thorne let out a weary chuckle. What's one more fight? I'm in. Jax glanced at Shadow, who stared back with unflinching loyalty. Finally, he turned to Celine, meeting her determined gaze. All right. Let's finish this. The group squared their shoulders, steeling themselves for whatever lay ahead. Together, they stepped deeper into the ancient structure, the shard's light guiding them through the darkness. Chapter 11. Into the depths. The air was noticeably thinner as Jax and the others ventured deeper into the structure. It felt suffocating, pressing against their chests with every step. There was a faint, acrid smell in the air, hinting at the ancient, lingering magic that saturated this place. The narrow corridor before them felt like the throat of some ancient beast, the walls pressing close with an almost palpable weight. The shard's glow dimmed slightly, as though the oppressive atmosphere had even begun to affect its radiance. Is it just me, or is it harder to breathe down here? Elyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her bow at the ready, her eyes scanning every shadow for movement. It's not just you, Celine said. Her tone was calm, but the faint tension in her posture betrayed her unease. The further down we go, the more this place resists us. It's like it's trying to crush us before we even reach the core of the magic. Thorne muttered something under his breath, his fingers tracing symbols in the air. A faint, golden glow flickered around him, a protective ward meant to keep the suffocating pressure at bay. I can hold this barrier for a while, but we need to keep moving. If we stop too long, the magic here will wear me down. Jax nodded, his grip tightening on the shard. It pulsed faintly, its rhythm like a distant heartbeat, steady but subdued. Then we move quickly. Keep your eyes open. If this place is pushing back, it means we're getting close. Shadow growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back as he padded forward beside Elyra. His fur bristled slightly, and his tail hung low, every muscle in his body tense and ready to spring at the first hint of danger. The wolf's usually graceful steps were slower, more cautious, as though he too felt the unseen weight pressing down on them. The corridor ended abruptly in a wide, circular room. The floor was uneven, covered in jagged stone tiles that looked as if they had been torn apart by some immense force. At the center stood a single pillar, cracked but still standing, its surface etched with runes that shimmered faintly in the shard's light. What is this place? Elyra asked, keeping her voice low. Thorne stepped closer to the pillar, his eyes narrowing as he studied the runes. It's another anchor. A weaker one than the ones we've seen so far. This might be why the magic here feels so disjointed. Celine moved beside him, her hands hovering over the pillar without touching it. If we disrupt this, it could destabilize the rest of the structure. That might make it easier for us to reach the core. Or it might bring this whole place down on our heads, Elyra said dryly. Not exactly a comforting thought. Jax took a step closer, the shard glowing brighter in his hand. We don't have a choice. If this anchor is connected to the core, we need to break it. Thorne, can you handle it? Thorne nodded, though his expression remained grim. I can try, but be ready for the fallout. Elyra raised her bow, and Shadow crouched low, his growl deepening. Celine closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent incantation. Jax positioned himself between them and the pillar, the shard's light growing steady and strong. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of magic. Then Thorne raised his staff, and the runes on the pillar flared to life. A wave of energy rippled outward, sending a shiver through the walls and floor. Cracks spread rapidly from the base of the pillar, and the room seemed to lurch. The oppressive weight in the air grew heavier, pressing down like an invisible hand. Celine's hands shot forward, a shield of violet light forming around the group as debris began to fall. The barrier shimmered like molten glass, emitting a faint hum that deepened into a resonant thrumming as the rocks struck it. Each impact sent ripples of light across its surface, crackling faintly as the debris was deflected and scattered harmlessly to the sides. "Keep going," she shouted over the roar. Thorne's staff blazed with golden light as he poured his power into the pillar. The runes flickered wildly, their once steady glow turning erratic. The shard in Jax's hand responded, its light pulsing faster, in time with the growing tremors. "It's working," Thorne yelled, his voice strained. "The anchor is breaking." Elyra loosed an arrow into the darkness beyond the room, the glowing projectile casting an eerie light that momentarily revealed the sharp, angular features of a shadowy figure. Her sharp eyes caught the movement just as it melted back into the gloom. A shadowy figure darted into view, its form shifting and unstable. She fired again, the glowing arrow piercing the figure and causing it to dissolve into wisps of smoke. "They're coming," Elyra called out, her voice carrying a sharp edge of urgency, tinged with a trace of fear and determination. It cut through the growing chaos, urging the others into action. "We've got company." Shadow lunged at another figure, his jaws snapping as he tore through its ephemeral body. Celine tightened the barrier, her spells growing brighter as more shadowy shapes emerged from the surrounding darkness. Jax stepped forward, the shard's light flaring as he held it high. "Thorne, we don't have much time," Jax shouted. The pillar cracked again, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber. The runes sputtered and dimmed, their light fading as the anchor's power waned. Thorne let out a gasp, falling to one knee as the golden glow around him faltered. "It's done," Thorne said hoarsely. "The anchor is broken." The room fell still. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and Jax took a deep breath as if finally able to fill his lungs. The others straightened subtly, relieved, yet the heavy residue of magic in the air kept them alert, their movements still cautious. Celine lowered the barrier, her hands trembling from the effort. Elyra scanned the shadows, her bow still raised, as Shadow moved to her side, his growl quieting. Jax helped Thorne to his feet, his gaze shifting to the now crumbling pillar. "Good work," he said. "Let's move. Whatever's left of this place won't stay stable for long." The group moved quickly, their steps careful on the uneven floor. The corridor ahead sloped downward, and the shard's light flickered faintly as they descended. A faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere below, and the air grew cooler with each step. The chill clung to their skin, heightening their sense of foreboding. The air grew cooler, the walls slick with condensation. Shadows clung to the edges of their vision, and the faint hum of magic was ever present. As they pressed on, a sense of foreboding settled over them. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and the air carried a subtle vibration, as if the structure itself was reacting to their presence. Jax felt the shard grow warmer in his hand, its glow steady but insistent. "We're getting close," Celine said softly. "I can feel it." Thorne nodded, his face still pale but his resolve firm. "Whatever's waiting ahead, we need to be ready." Elyra narked an arrow, her eyes scanning the darkness. "I'm always ready," she said, though the faint tension in her voice betrayed her wariness. Shadow growled low, his ears swiveling toward the unseen depths below. His growl deepened as he took a step closer to Elyra, his movements deliberate and tense, as though readying himself for the unseen threat. Jax gripped the shard tightly, his heart beating in time with its pulse. "We're ready," Jax said. "Let's finish this." With a final glance at each other, they moved forward into the unknown. The corridor's descent became steeper, and the walls seemed to shift under the shard's glow. The once smooth, slick stone now appeared jagged, carved by time and forces long since faded. Each step brought a new sense of unease, as though the path itself resisted their progress. Celine glanced at Thorne, who lagged a half-step behind. His shoulders were hunched, his staff dragging slightly against the floor. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low. He straightened, the golden light around him flickering as he tightened his grip. "I'll manage." The deeper we go, the stronger the magic becomes. It's demanding. Elyra, ahead of them, turned her head briefly. So we're heading straight for the center of the storm. Great. Shadow let out a soft growl, his ears swiveling forward. The wolf's keen senses picked up what the others couldn't yet see or hear. His tail stiffened, and Elyra reached for her bow. What is it? Jax asked, his grip on the shard tightening. The light from the crystal grew brighter, as though responding to his tension. Before Shadow could move, the corridor widened into another chamber. This one was different. The walls were covered in dense clusters of crystals, each pulsating faintly. In the center, a figure stood motionless. It was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, blurred as though it were more shadow than flesh. Its eyes glowed a deep red, and the air around it shimmered with heat. Selene stopped abruptly, her breath catching. That's not a construct. That's something else. The figure raised a hand, and the crystals on the walls flared. The room filled with a sharp, piercing sound, and a wave of energy rushed toward them. Shields. Selene shouted, throwing up a protective barrier just as the energy struck. The barrier rippled with shimmering waves, faint sparks crackling along its edges as it absorbed the brunt of the force. A deep vibration hummed through the air, and the surface of the barrier seemed to ripple like water, deflecting the energy in glowing arcs that dissipated into the surrounding walls. The impact rippled through the shield, forcing her back a step. Thorne joined her, their combined magic holding the barrier steady. Elyra narked an arrow and fired. The glowing projectile struck the figure's outstretched arm, causing it to stumble. Shadow lunged forward, his movements swift and precise. His teeth snapped at the figure's legs, but his jaws closed on nothing. The figure blurred, reappearing a few feet away. It can move faster than us, Elyra called out, drawing another arrow. We need to slow it down. Jax stepped forward, the shard in his hand flaring. We'll hit it all at once. Thorne, Selene, channel everything into a binding spell. Elyra, go for its center. Shadow, keep it distracted. As Jax raised the shard, the room's crystals pulsed brighter. The figure turned its glowing red eyes toward him, and for a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then it moved, faster than they could react, appearing directly in front of Jax. The shard flared brilliantly, and the figure stopped. A sound, something between a hiss and a growl, emanated from it as it recoiled. Jax stepped back, lifting the shard higher. Now, he shouted. Selene and Thorne's combined magic surged forward, encircling the figure in a ring of violet and gold light. Elyra fired a precise shot, the arrow striking the figure's center and exploding in a burst of energy. Shadow lunged again, his teeth meeting resistance this time as he clamped down on one of the figure's limbs. The room shook. The crystals dimmed, and the figure let out a low, guttural sound before dissolving into a swirl of dark smoke. The oppressive heat faded, and the air returned to a heavy stillness. The sudden coolness was jarring, like stepping into a cave's chill after standing in the noonday sun. Even as the heat subsided, an eerie quiet remained, settling over them like a shroud. What was that? Elyra asked, her voice sharp. Selene lowered her hands, the barrier fading. I don't know. But it wasn't like the constructs we've faced. It felt aware. Jax lowered the shard, his breathing uneven. It's not going to be the last thing we face. The core's getting closer. We need to keep moving. Thorne nodded, though his expression was grim. If this is what guards the outer chambers, the core itself will be far worse. The group shared a moment of silent understanding. Shadow moved back to Elyra's side, his growl gone but his ears still alert. The corridor ahead beckoned, and the shard's light pulsed with quiet urgency. Without another word, they pressed onward. The chamber's crystals faded into the distance, their glow replaced by the steady light of the shard as they ventured further into the heart of the ancient structure. The corridor widened as they descended, the slick walls giving way to rough-hewn stone that seemed almost clawed out of the earth. The faint hum of the shard grew more insistent, its pulsing light casting jagged shadows that danced like living things. The hum seemed to vibrate through their bodies, carrying a faint, resonant tone that made them uneasy. Selene slowed her pace, her violet eyes scanning the walls. Her breathing quickened slightly as her gaze darted from one corner to another, and she glanced repeatedly over her shoulder, as if half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The magic here feels off. Stronger, but more fractured. It seemed to distort the air itself, creating a strange shimmering effect. Shadows didn't hold their shape, twisting and flickering as though the walls themselves were alive, responding to an unseen force. Thorne nodded, his staff tapping lightly against the ground. The deeper we go, the more unstable it becomes. It's like the foundation of this place is unraveling. Jax glanced over his shoulder. Keep moving. If it's unraveling, we're running out of time. Elyra didn't reply. Her bow was raised, an arrow narked as her gaze swept the path ahead. Shadow padded silently at her side, his silver fur nearly blending into the faint light from the shard. His ears swiveled back and forth as though catching faint, inaudible sounds, and his tail twitched in small, deliberate movements, signaling his heightened awareness. His growl was low and steady, a constant warning. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Their breaths became visible, faint clouds in the dim light, and frost began to cling to the edges of their gear, crackling softly with each step. The faint sound of water dripping echoed in the distance, mingling with the ever-present hum. Jax tightened his grip on the shard, its glow flaring briefly as if to remind them it was still their guide. Ahead, the corridor opened into a massive cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and shimmering patches of what looked like crystalline ice. In the center of the cavern stood a towering obelisk, its surface covered in runes that pulsed faintly. The shard's light seemed to dim as they approached, the runes drinking in its glow. Thorne stepped forward, his voice low. Another anchor. A powerful one. Selene placed a hand on his arm. Wait. I can feel something. Not just the anchor's magic, but a presence. It's watching us. The group froze. Elyra's sharp eyes darted around the cavern, her fingers tightening on her bowstring. Shadow's growl deepened, his ears flattening. Show yourself, Jax called out, his voice steady. The shard's light flared, illuminating the cavern in stark relief. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall and humanoid, but indistinct, its form shifted as if made of smoke and shadow. Its eyes glowed a piercing white, and it carried a staff of crystalline light that pulsed in time with the anchor's runes. Selene's breath caught. It's a guardian. A true guardian. Thorne raised his staff, his jaw tightening. We've dealt with guardians before. Not like this, she replied. This one is different. Stronger. The guardian raised its staff, and the cavern seemed to come alive. The crystalline ice on the floor glowed, and shapes began to rise from it, twisting, jagged constructs of ice and shadow that seemed to crackle faintly as they moved. Their forms constantly shifted, breaking apart and reforming as if unable to maintain a stable shape. A faint, eerie sound accompanied their movement, like the grinding of ice shards or the whisper of distant, ghostly voices. The air grew colder still, and the faint hum of the shard was drowned out by the resonant pulse of the anchor. Elyra loosed an arrow without hesitation. The glowing projectile streaked toward the guardian, but it stopped midair, caught by an invisible force. The guardian tilted its head, and the arrow shattered into fragments that scattered harmlessly to the ground. Defensive magic, Thorne muttered, his voice edged with frustration. We'll have to get closer. Jax stepped forward, the shard blazing in his hand. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing more of the constructs as they formed. Elyra, Shadow, cover Selene and Thorne. We need to get past the constructs and break that anchor. Elyra nodded, her movements swift and precise. She loosed another arrow, this time targeting one of the constructs. The projectile struck true, the construct shattering into a cascade of icy shards. Shadow lunged at another, his powerful jaws snapping through its brittle form. Selene and Thorne advanced cautiously, their combined magic weaving a protective barrier as the constructs closed in. The Guardian's staff flared, and a wave of freezing energy surged through the cavern. Selene's barrier held, but frost crept along its edges, threatening to crack it. Thorne's voice rose in an incantation, golden light surging from his staff to reinforce the shield. Jax! Selene shouted. The Guardian's focus is on us. Go now. Jax hesitated for only a moment before sprinting toward the obelisk. The shard's light cut a path through the darkness, but as he approached, the Guardian turned its gaze on him. A flick of its staff sent a jagged lance of ice hurtling toward him. Jax dropped into a roll, the shard's glow forming a shield that deflected the attack just in time. Reaching the base of the obelisk, Jax placed the shard against its surface. The shard grew hotter in his hand, and a resonant hum emerged, matching the rhythm of the anchor's energy. The runes flared violently, their glow intensifying as they pushed back against the shard's light. He felt the resistance, the power of the anchor fighting to remain intact. Come on, Jax muttered through gritted teeth. He poured his will into the shard, forcing its light into the runes. The obelisk shuddered, a low groan reverberating through the cavern. Meanwhile, Selene and Thorne held their ground, their barrier flickering as more constructs emerged. Elyra's arrows struck with precision, each one destroying a construct before it could close the distance. Shadow darted between the enemies, his snarls echoing as he tore through them. Jax, hurry! Thorne shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he glanced nervously at the constructs closing in. The obelisk cracked, a hairline fracture spreading across its surface. The Guardian let out a low, resonant sound, raising its staff again. This time, the freezing wave struck with greater force, the air crystallizing around Jax's feet. Selene pushed her magic harder, the barrier flaring brighter. It's not going to let him finish, she cried. Then we'll have to make it. Elyra loosed 2 arrows in rapid succession, one shattering against a construct, the other aiming for the Guardian. This time, the arrow broke through the defensive magic, striking the Guardian's arm. It flinched, and the constructs faltered. Jax pressed harder, his hand trembling as the shard's glow grew blinding. He braced himself against the obelisk, channeling more power as the energy coursing through the shard pushed him to his limit. The obelisk trembled, cracks spreading like a spiderweb. With a final surge of light, the shard's power overwhelmed the anchor. The obelisk shattered, fragments flying outward as the runes extinguished. The cavern went still. The constructs crumbled into heaps of frozen dust, their forms dissolving into the cold air. The Guardian staggered, its glowing eyes dimming. It turned toward Jax, its voice echoing faintly. You cannot stop it. Then, with a final, mournful sound, the Guardian dissolved into shadow, leaving only the faint hum of the shard behind. Selene and Thorne lowered their magic, the barrier fading. Elyra approached Jax, her bow still in hand but her posture less tense. Good work, Jax said, his breathing heavy. That anchor was stronger than the others. Whatever's at the core must be worse, Selene finished, her voice quiet. Much worse. Shadow let out a low whine, moving to stand by Elyra's side. She placed a hand on his head, her gaze on the shattered obelisk. We need to keep moving before it has a chance to recover. Thorne nodded, though his expression was weary. If we take too long, we'll be right back where we started. Jax lifted the shard, its light steady once more. Then let's go. The core is close. We're almost there. Without another word, they turned and pressed forward, their footsteps crunching on the icy floor as the shard guided them into the depths of the ancient structure. As they moved deeper, the corridors became narrower and the air thicker, like wading through invisible water. The shard's glow dimmed further, its light struggling against the encroaching darkness. Every step seemed harder than the last, the floor slick with frost and uneven stone. Thorne leaned heavily on his staff, his breathing labored. His face twisted into a grimace, and he wiped sweat from his brow with a shaky hand before struggling to regain his balance. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. The magic here, it's draining me faster than I can recover. Keep going, Selene said, though her voice was strained. We're almost there. I can feel it. Elyra glanced back, her bow at the ready. Can you also feel whatever's ahead of us? Because it's not friendly. Shadow growled low, his ears swiveling forward. His tail raised slightly, and he took a cautious step forward, his muscles tensed as if preparing to pounce. His nose twitched, picking up a faint, acrid scent that made him bare his teeth. Elyra placed a steadying hand on his back, her eyes scanning the passage ahead. Jax adjusted his grip on the shard, its light pulsing weakly in his hand. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. Stay close and be ready. The narrow corridor opened abruptly into another chamber, this one smaller but more oppressive. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on them as though the room itself resisted their presence. Dim lighting from the shard's glow created strange, shifting shadows that seemed to dance along the wall. The walls were lined with ancient, corroded metal panels, each etched with runes that pulsed erratically, creating an unsettling, chaotic pattern. The light from the runes didn't just flicker, it shifted unpredictably, casting strange shadows that twisted and writhed on the walls, as if the room itself were alive. At the far end of the room, a figure sat hunched over a dais, its form obscured by shadows. A faint red glow emanated from its chest, pulsing like a heartbeat, casting eerie, shifting reflections on the walls. "Another guardian?" Selene whispered, her voice barely audible. Elyra shook her head. "No. This one feels different. Stronger. Like it's waiting for us." The figure shifted, its head lifting slowly. As it straightened, the red glow intensified, revealing a humanoid construct clad in blackened, metallic armor. Its face was featureless save for two burning crimson eyes, and its movements were unnervingly precise. In one hand it held a sword that shimmered like molten glass, and in the other, a shield carved with runes that pulsed in time with the light in its chest. Jax felt the shard grow hotter in his grip, its pulse quickening. The heat spread through his arm, and the quickening pulse sent a faint vibration through his hand, as if the shard itself was responding to an invisible force. "Get ready," he said quietly. "This one isn't going to let us pass without a fight." The construct stepped off the dais, the sound of its heavy boots reverberating endlessly through the chamber, the echoes unnervingly close as if the walls themselves amplified each step. As it approached, the air grew colder, and a faint hum filled the room, rising in intensity until it was nearly deafening. The runes on the walls flared, and tendrils of energy arced toward the construct, wrapping around it like chains of light. "Thorne, Selene, can you block that?" Elyra asked, her voice tight. Thorne raised his staff, golden light swirling around him as he muttered an incantation. A shield of energy formed, intercepting some of the tendrils, but the construct's movements didn't falter. It raised its sword, and the room erupted in a blinding flash of red light. Elyra loosed an arrow, the glowing projectile streaking toward the construct's chest. It flared brightly as it flew, leaving a faint, shimmering trail that briefly illuminated the path behind it. It struck the shield, which flared with a burst of crimson energy, absorbing the attack. Shadow lunged, his claws scraping against the construct's armor, but it swatted him aside with a single, fluid motion. Selene chanted rapidly, violet light forming into a whip-like tendril that lashed out at the construct. It struck the creature's shoulder, causing it to stagger briefly. "We can weaken it," she called out, her voice filled with both confidence and desperation, urging the others to keep up their assault. "Focus your attacks where the runes meet." Jax moved in, the shard blazing brighter. He held it high, channeling its energy into a concentrated beam of light. The beam struck the construct's chest, where the red glow pulsed the strongest. The construct froze, its movements stuttering as the light from the shard clashed with its internal energy. "Now!" Jax shouted. "Hit it while it's weakened." Elyra fired again, this time aiming for the construct's exposed joints. The arrow found its mark, lodging in a gap between the armor plates. The construct jerked, its movements becoming erratic. Shadow lunged once more, this time sinking his teeth into the weakened joint. The construct raised its sword to strike, but Selene's magic wrapped around its arm, pulling it back. "Thorne, break the connection to the runes," Selene cried. Thorne nodded, his staff glowing brighter. He muttered an incantation, and golden energy surged toward the walls, severing the tendrils of light that linked the construct to the runes. The room's hum faltered, and the crimson glow in the construct's chest dimmed. Its movements grew sluggish, the weight of its armor causing it to stagger. Selene seized the opportunity, casting a burst of violet light that struck the construct's shield, fracturing it. Elyra followed with another arrow, this one aimed directly at the exposed core of the creature. The projectile struck true, shattering the protective layer and causing the crimson glow to flicker violently. "Now, Jax!" Selene shouted. Jax surged forward, the shard burning in his grasp. He moved cautiously, scanning the room for incoming attacks, his steps measured and deliberate as he prepared to dodge any incoming strikes. He pressed it against the construct's chest, unleashing a torrent of light that overwhelmed the remaining defenses. The construct let out a deep, resonant sound, neither a roar nor a scream, but a hollow, mournful tone that echoed through the chamber. Its crimson core fractured, and the entire construct collapsed into a heap of blackened metal and fading embers. The room fell silent, save for the faint, steady pulse of the shard. The oppressive cold began to lift, and the runes on the walls dimmed to nothing. The group stood motionless, their breathing heavy, as the last traces of energy faded into the air. Selene lowered her hands, her magic dissipating. "It's done," she said softly. But that was only one. Jax looked down at the shard, its light steady but subdued. "We're getting closer. This thing is reacting more strongly the deeper we go. Whatever's at the core, it's waiting." Thorne leaned on his staff, his face pale but determined. "Then let's not waste any more time." Elyra stepped forward, her bow still in hand. Shadow moved beside her, his growl now a low rumble. "We'll face whatever comes next." "We always do." Jax nodded, the shard glowing faintly as he turned toward the passage ahead. The group followed, their footsteps echoing in the quiet chamber. The path before them was different now, narrower and more jagged, as if carved by countless struggles over centuries. The shard's glow flickered, barely illuminating the uneven walls that seemed to close in around them. Every step was uncertain, their boots scraping against loose stones that tumbled into unseen depths. Elyra's breath fogged in the chill air, her knuckles white on her bow. "This place isn't just trying to stop us, it's trying to trap us. Every turn feels like it's leading us deeper into its grip." Thorne pressed forward, his staff tapping against the stone floor. His grip tightened around the staff, his knuckles whitening, as if bracing himself for the unknown. Each tap sent faint echoes back through the narrow passage, the sound growing heavier with each step, as though the weight of the ancient magic ahead pressed down on them all. "The magic here is ancient, older than anything we've faced so far. It's no longer just fractured, it's fraying at the edges, coming apart at the seams. That's what we're feeling, chaos breaking through the cracks." Jax tightened his grip on the shard. Its pulsing light was weaker now, as if it too were weighed down by the oppressive energy. "If this place is falling apart, we need to move fast. We can't let it collapse before we reach the core." Shadow growled low, his ears flicking back and forth. He crouched slightly, his muscles tensed and tail twitching, as though sensing danger in the shadows ahead. The wolf's steps were more deliberate, and his tail was held low, signaling his unease. Selene placed a hand on his back for reassurance, though her gaze was fixed ahead. The violet tint of her eyes seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, a testament to her focus. "We're close," she said softly. "I can feel it. The core is just beyond that next bend." Jax nodded, motioning for the group to press forward. The air grew heavier with each step, and the faint hum of the shard became a steady thrum, as if resonating with something just out of reach. The corridor widened suddenly into a cavernous chamber, the walls and ceiling lost in darkness. At the center stood a massive crystal formation, jagged and pulsing with a sickly green light. Runes spiraled around its base, flowing upward like veins, their glow uneven and erratic. "This must be the core," Thorne said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it's already destabilized." Elyra narked an arrow, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows for movement. "It won't let us take it down without a fight." Before anyone could respond, the room shifted. The ground trembled beneath their feet, sending cracks racing through the floor. Shadow barked sharply, his hackles rising. A deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, followed by a low, rumbling voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Foolish intruders," it said, each word vibrating through the air. "You come to sever the threads, to break what holds the balance. But you will not succeed." From the shadows emerged figures, more constructs, but larger and more defined. Their forms were less jagged, their movements more fluid. They wielded weapons that glowed with the same green light as the core, their steps heavy and deliberate. In the center of them stood a single, towering guardian, its form more solid than the others, its eyes burning with an intense, otherworldly glow. "Stand ready," Jax called out. The shard flared in his hand, casting the room in its warm, golden light. Elyra loosed her first arrow, the projectile striking one of the constructs and shattering it into fragments. Shadow lunged at another, his fangs finding purchase in the construct's arm and tearing it free. Selene and Thorne began weaving their magic, a barrier of violet and gold forming around the group as the constructs closed in. The central guardian raised its arms, and the core responded. The green light intensified, sending out waves of energy that crashed against the barrier. Selene gritted her teeth, holding the shield firm as Thorne chanted louder, reinforcing their defenses. Jax stepped forward, the shard blazing brighter. "We need to focus on that guardian," he said, his voice grim and commanding, each word laced with the urgency of the battle around them. "It's linked to the core. If we can sever that connection, the constructs will fall apart." Elyra fired again, her arrows finding weak points in the construct's armor. The constructs staggered at first, the glowing green light in their cores faltering as cracks spread across their jagged forms. Then, with a final shimmer of emerald energy, they collapsed into piles of fragmented crystal and dissipated into the air. Shadow moved like a blur, his attacks relentless. Selene directed a surge of energy toward the central guardian, but the attack dissipated against its shield, barely leaving a mark. "It's too strong," Selene shouted, her voice tinged with desperation, as though she were wrestling with frustration and determination all at once. "We need to disrupt the core itself." Thorne nodded, his voice steady. "If I can break the runes at the base, it'll weaken the Guardian's connection. But I'll need cover." Jax turned to Elyra and Shadow. "Keep the constructs off Thorne. Selene and I will keep the barrier up." Elyra's eyes narrowed. "You better break those runes fast." Thorne moved carefully, his staff glowing with golden light as he approached the base of the core. The constructs seemed to sense his intent, turning their focus toward him. Elyra and Shadow intercepted, their attacks swift and unrelenting. Jax and Selene poured their energy into the barrier, holding back the Guardian's onslaught. As Thorne reached the runes, he knelt, placing his hand against the glowing symbols. He began to chant, his voice rising above the noise of battle. The runes pulsed erratically, their glow faltering as cracks began to form. The Guardian let out a roar, its voice shaking the chamber. It turned its gaze on Thorne, raising one massive hand to strike. Jax stepped forward, raising the shard. A beam of golden light shot out, striking the Guardian's arm and stopping it mid-swing. The Guardian staggered, but it didn't fall. "Thorne, hurry," Jax shouted, his voice strained. Thorne's chant reached its climax. The runes at the base of the core shattered, their light extinguishing in an instant. The Guardian froze, its movements jerky and unstable. Elyra's arrows pierced through its armor, and Shadow lunged at its legs, bringing it crashing to the ground. Jax stepped closer to the core, the shard blazing brighter than ever. The sickly green light of the crystal dimmed, the pulsing slowing as its power waned. The constructs around them crumbled, their weapons clattering to the ground as their forms disintegrated into dust. "It's working," Selene said, her voice triumphant. "Keep going." Jax placed the shard against the core. The shard emitted a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the chamber, its glow intensifying and illuminating the crystalline surface as cracks began to spread outward. Its light surged, flooding the chamber with a golden glow. The crystal trembled, cracks spreading rapidly across its surface. A deafening roar echoed through the chamber as the core's energy collapsed in on itself, sending out a shockwave that threw the group back. When the light faded, the room was silent. The core was no more, only fragments of the crystal remained, scattered across the ground. The oppressive weight that had filled the chamber was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. Jax rose to his feet, helping Selene up. Thorne leaned heavily on his staff, his face pale but relieved. Elyra lowered her bow, her eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. Shadow shook his fur, letting out a low growl before settling beside her. "We did it," Jax said, his voice quiet but firm. The core is destroyed. Celine nodded, a faint smile on her lips. We've weakened whatever force was holding this place together. Now we just need to get out before it collapses completely. The group gathered their strength, their eyes set on the path ahead. They had succeeded in their mission, but the true test was yet to come. With the shard still glowing faintly in Jax's hand, they pressed on, ready to face whatever lay beyond. The cavern echoed with a strange stillness, a void left behind by the shattered core. The air felt lighter, as if the oppressive weight had finally been lifted, but the silence carried an unsettling quality. It was the kind of quiet that made every small sound seem too loud, every step echo unnaturally long, putting the group on edge. Small fragments of crystal caught the shard's faint glow, their jagged edges glittering like tiny stars scattered across the floor. Each step the group took crunched softly against the remnants, the sound an eerie reminder of the power they had just silenced. Thorne stumbled slightly, catching himself on his staff. "The magic, it's still lingering," he muttered. "Like a ghost. Faint, but not gone." Celine glanced at him, her violet eyes reflecting the pale light. "It's the residue of something ancient. This wasn't just a core, it was a tether to something far greater. We severed it, but it doesn't mean the influence is completely gone." Jax frowned, his grip on the shard tightening. "If there's still a trace, we can't risk it rebuilding itself. We need to move before whatever's left tries to stabilize." Elyra was already at the far side of the cavern, scanning the next corridor. "Path's clear for now," she called out. Shadow stood at her side, his ears twitching as if listening for the faintest disturbance. Thorne straightened, though his face was pale. "Then let's not linger. The last thing we need is for this place to start fighting back again." They pressed forward, the corridor beyond the cavern sloping upward. The air grew colder with each step, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat they'd felt earlier. Frost formed on the walls in delicate patterns, the jagged ice glinting faintly under the shard's glow. The group moved cautiously, the silence around them only broken by their footsteps. Elyra's hand hovered near her quiver, her expression tense. Her eyes darted toward every shadow as she muttered, "I don't like how quiet it is. It's like the calm before a storm." Shadow's low growl was her only response. Jax nodded. "Stay sharp. Just because we took down the core doesn't mean this place is empty." As they climbed, the walls seemed to tighten, as though the structure itself resisted their departure. Celine reached out with her magic, her eyes narrowing. "Something's still here. Not the core, but a fragment of it." Elyra glanced over her shoulder. "Then let's make sure it doesn't follow us." The group pressed on, every sense on high alert. Ahead, the passage opened into another chamber, this one smaller but lined with crystalline structures that pulsed faintly. The air felt charged, and even the shard seemed to respond, its glow fluctuating like a beating heart. Thorne knelt near one of the crystal formations, running his hand lightly over its surface. "Residual energy. It's trying to re-anchor itself. We need to break these shards before it stabilizes." "More fighting, then," Elyra said, notching an arrow. "Fine by me." Celine raised her hands, her violet magic swirling. "We don't have to wait for them to attack this time. Let's take the offensive." With a coordinated effort, they unleashed their strength on the crystalline structures. Arrows struck true, magic flared, and Shadow's claws shredded the brittle surfaces. The chamber echoed with the sound of shattering crystal, the light from the formations fading one by one. When the last crystal fractured, a low, mournful hum filled the air. The energy seemed to drain away, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Jax lowered the shard, its light now steady and calm. "That should be enough," Thorne said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "The fragment won't be able to regain its footing now." Celine lowered her hands, glancing at Jax. "We need to keep moving. The entire structure is unstable." Elyra stepped past them, Shadow at her side. "Then let's go. We don't want to be here when the rest of this place comes down." They moved quickly, the shard lighting their path. The corridor began to slope upward again, the air growing fresher and cooler with every step. A faint breeze carried with it a distant scent of greenery, hinting at their return to the surface and filling them with a sliver of hope. After what felt like an eternity in the oppressive depths, they finally emerged into the open air. The sky above was streaked with fading sunlight, a pale glow that illuminated the rocky landscape around them. Elyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and Shadow padded forward, sniffing the air. "We made it," Jax said quietly, lowering the shard. "But the real battle might only be starting." Selene nodded, her gaze scanning the horizon. "Whatever that core was tied to, it won't be happy that we severed it." Thorne leaned heavily on his staff, his expression grim. "We bought ourselves time. That's all we can hope for now." Elyra shouldered her bow, her eyes sharp. "Time to prepare. Time to figure out what comes next." Jax tightened his grip on the shard, feeling its warmth steady in his hand. "And when it comes, we'll be ready." The landscape that greeted them beyond the ruins was starkly different from the labyrinthine corridors and glowing shards of the core. A vast expanse of jagged rock stretched out beneath a sky that seemed to simmer with dull, reddish clouds. The air was eerily still, carrying only the faintest whisper of wind. Elyra loosened her grip on her bow, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "It's quiet," she said, her voice subdued. "Maybe too quiet." Jax adjusted his grip on the shard, its faint glow now steady and warm against his palm. "Quiet can be a good thing. We need the time to regroup." Shadow padded forward, his silver fur catching the muted light as he sniffed at the dry, cracked ground. His growl deepened, and he paused for a moment, glancing around nervously before continuing. He growled low and looked back toward Elyra. The wolf's unease was palpable, even in the open air. Thorne planted his staff into the earth and leaned on it heavily. His brow furrowed in concentration, and his shoulders tightened as though bracing himself against an invisible weight. The lines on his face deepened, suggesting both weariness and determination. "This isn't over," he said, glancing up at the shifting clouds. "That core wasn't just an anchor. It was a beacon. Whatever it called may not have arrived yet, but it will." Selene nodded, brushing a strand of dark hair out of her face. Her expression was thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the distance as if piecing together a puzzle. Her tone carried a note of quiet determination, with just the faintest hint of worry. "I felt it too. The magic there, it was more than just ancient. It was connected to something larger. Breaking it was like cutting a thread, but the rest of the web is still intact." Jax surveyed the rocky terrain, his expression grim. "Then we need to keep moving. If that core was a beacon, we don't want to be here when whatever it summoned arrives." Elyra squinted against the dim light, her gaze darting back and forth as though anticipating movement from every shadow. "There's a ridge that way," she said, pointing toward a jagged line of cliffs in the distance. "If we can reach it, we'll have a better vantage point. Maybe we'll even find some shelter." Shadow barked once, a short, sharp sound, and trotted ahead. The group fell into step behind him, their movements cautious and deliberate. The shard's light remained steady, casting a soft glow that made the rocks gleam faintly, creating long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch out endlessly across the barren landscape. As they walked, the oppressive silence pressed down on them. Every step echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around them. Elyra kept her bow at the ready, her sharp eyes scanning every rock and crevice for signs of movement. Thorne broke the silence, his voice carrying a faint edge of suspicion. "The way the core shattered," he began, his tone thoughtful. "It felt wrong. Not just unstable, but as though it was designed to fail. As if breaking it played into whatever plans were already in motion." Selene frowned. "You think this was a trap? That the core wasn't meant to hold them at bay, but to bring them here?" Thorne nodded. "It's a possibility. One I don't like." Jax remained silent, his thoughts focused inward. The shard felt warm in his hand, almost comforting. Yet there was a faint hum beneath its surface, a subtle reminder of the power it contained, and the responsibility it demanded. As they reached the base of the ridge, the fading sunlight cast long, eerie shadows across the jagged rocks. The dimming light seemed to make the terrain feel even more desolate and foreboding. The red clouds above deepened in hue, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Shadow led the way up the narrow path, his movements sure-footed despite the loose gravel and jagged rocks. At the top, they found a shallow cave carved into the cliff face. Elyra ducked inside first, her bow still in hand. "It's empty," she called back. "For now." Thorne followed, his staff glowing faintly as he stepped into the dim space. "This will have to do," he said. "It's not much, but it'll give us some cover." Selene glanced around the cave, her gaze lingering on the faint scorch marks along the walls. The blackened streaks seemed to speak of past battles, of a struggle that once raged here. Perhaps long ago, this place had been a refuge, a last stand, or a prison for something ancient. The others noticed it too. Elyra's hand tightened on her bow, and Shadow's ears twitched as though expecting to hear echoes of the conflict. Even Thorne's expression darkened as he traced the faint lines with his eyes, as if recalling a history that had never been written down. This place was used before. By something, or someone. Elyra tightened her grip on her bow. "Let's hope they don't come back." Jax remained at the entrance, his eyes on the horizon. The shard pulsed faintly, its light reflecting off the jagged rocks below. "We'll need to keep watch," he said. "Two at a time. If something is following us, we'll know before it gets here." Shadow lay down near the entrance, his ears twitching as he scanned the horizon with a low growl. Elyra knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his fur. "We've bought ourselves time," Jax said quietly, turning back to face the group. "Let's use it wisely." The night passed slowly. The silence outside the cave was near total, broken only by the occasional faint sound of wind stirring the dry air. Jax sat near the entrance with Selene, the shard's soft glow casting long shadows on the cave wall. The moving shadows seemed alive, shifting with each flicker of the light, as if the cavern itself were breathing. "Do you think we'll make it through this?" Selene asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jax glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice," he replied. "We have to." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on the shard. "It's more than just a tool, isn't it? That shard, it's alive in some way." Jax didn't answer immediately. He stared at the faintly glowing crystal in his hand, its warmth steady. "It has a purpose," he said at last. "I don't know if that makes it alive, but it feels aware." Selene's eyes narrowed. "And it chose you." Jax looked away, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't feel like a choice," he said. "It feels like a burden." The conversation lapsed into silence. Outside, the sky began to lighten, the red clouds giving way to a pale, grey dawn. The group roused themselves slowly, stretching stiff muscles and preparing to move. Thorne stood at the cave's entrance, his staff planted firmly in the ground. "There's a path down the other side," he said. "It's narrow, but it'll lead us away from this ridge and toward safer ground." Elyra glanced at Jax. "You're sure it's safe to move now?" He nodded, the shard's light steady in his grip. "Safer than staying here." Shadow stood and stretched, his ears perked and alert. Elyra adjusted her quiver, her eyes scanning the horizon one last time before stepping out of the cave. "Let's go," Jax said. "We're not out of this yet."